time to grow up, be a man. And, oh God, I can't imagine. I mean, Barry Gordy was a lot smaller than T.D. Jakes. God, it must have been suffocating.
Good night.
Okay, let me see. I think, am I ready? I'm about to go live, and so I'll have
Okay, go
to,
ahead, man.
and I should see you. You stay out of trouble, but all the links should, I don't know when they're gonna let me release the material, but we'll see.
Okay.
All right, so look, be in
Good.
prayer. I'll talk to you very soon,
All right.
tomorrow,
Talk
okay?
to you later.
Bye bye. All right. Hi, there's one person here. There are two people over here. Let me put this other channel up. I mean, you guys said you're going to stay up. I mean, you guys are liars. You're like Sony. You're liars. Liars. You said you'd be here. And yes, this is part 2. Okay, you guys are liars. I told you to be ready. I'm coming back. And I'm not Jesus. We can get right into this. I'm not going to mess around with you guys. Okay, they're just 2 of you. Yes, this is part 2. Why are you asking the same question? You know, come on. Get with it. You've got to get on top of this. You've got to be professionals. The whole world is watching you. Oh, my nose is so red, and it's so big. I need to get it made smaller. My dad always said it was ugly. Okay, I'm going to give it a few minutes, and then I'm going to let it rip. I hope all you guys show up. Right now, there's just like a few of you, and it's time for people to come back. You guys need to come back. I mean, I kept my word. Okay, I'm not like Sony. And my glasses are tortoise, not turtle. Okay, I'm gonna have to move this heater back. It's hot. Ooh, it's so hot. I don't want to be hot. I want to be cool. You know, being one of the cool kids. Hold on one second. This is Dewan B. Hey, what's up, Buddha? How was the show?
What's up, Dr. Short?
I'm good. How was the show, Buddha?
Who's this?
Well, you know who it is.
It was, yeah, it was a good show.
It was a lot of fun.
Q&A with her from Patriot.
Yeah, it's really, really great. Did you get some people to watch?
I didn't watch. I didn't put it on my channel yet. I just went straight to Odell's their channel.
Well, it did okay, so I'm pushing it around. She's really a great lady. He's lucky. He better go down on her for the show she did tonight. That's the least he can do. You know. We'll send up some tartar sauce to help him get through it. It was fun. It was fun. And it's different from our other shows where everybody just talks about the same 2 or 3 things, which is annoying. And it's really good doing shows with you because you know something. Do you know how hard it is? I know you know. When you have like people, they just don't know shit. And you have to do the whole damn show, all the talking. It's like overwhelming. It's like, damn, can't you help me a little bit?
Yeah, and I hate listening to shows where the host or the person like people who've interviewed you in the past, where I see you going in a certain direction, and they gotta pull it. They gotta pull it back up to the surface level. I hate when that happens. You know, like you gotta be able to. If the guest goes somewhere, you gotta be able to go there with them.
Well, the problem, this is why I've got a book. So I'm about to go in. I've got a couple of people waiting. Not that many. They lied to me. I told them I'd be back at 10, and you know, I bet you I'll get reparations checks before I get the audience back. That's really pathetic.
Yeah.
I mean, they
I
just.
gotta take this call.
Okay,
I gotta
well,
take this
I'll
call.
see you. Let the force go with you.
All right.
Okay, guys, I'm back. All right, so there's just one person. Just one. Now, I'm going to wait because you guys promised me and I'm not going to be messed with. Okay, I need people to respect what I'm doing. I work very hard. I didn't have a childhood, so you guys could have all this great information. And I want you guys to treat it with the respect that I deserve as a professional. And I am a professional, very consummate. Okay, let me see. I'm getting this. That's my close-up. Do you see my close-up? Do you like it? I like it too. So I'm waiting. I want to get at least 15 people before I start. Okay. And no, this isn't part 2. God, I answered your question. Let me read. I'm trying to figure out where's everybody. Okay. Let me see. It's 10:15. I'm going to give it 10 minutes. How many of you like Jaguar? How many of you like the show? Tell me. I thought it was a good show. Hey, how you doing, Savannah? I hope you enjoyed the show with Jaguar. We're going to start up in 10 minutes. Let me get my book. I've got to turn the heat off now. It's too hot, man. It's sort of like the sheriff's office in Encino. It's really hot. You think it was a good show? Okay, well, I want everybody to share it. Share the show. In fact, retweet this. A lot of people get lost. You tell them you'll come back in an hour, and then they don't show up. Then they want to ask questions. It's kind of retarded. I need people to try harder. So, okay, Brother Mark, Savannah, Reparations Nation. Okay. Okay. There's another book, Yvette. Drop me an email. There's some other books. In fact, I have one book right here. Haven't looked at it thoroughly, but it's called, take the sticker off. It doesn't look hot. I want things to look really nice, Okay. There are a couple of books. This is a really good book on how they treated mentally ill patients, and I've got some other books coming. This is a very good Michael Jackson impression. I beg your pardon. And you can't do better, even if you're twice the woman I ever was. Okay? All right. 1, 2, so that's 8, 16, there's 17. Let me turn this heater off because it is hot. It's too hot. I don't want to burn up. I just want to not be cold. Okay, here we go. Just trying to get this together. Okay. I'm almost ready. I had my tea. Okay. Wow. Let me see. 7, 2, 7. Now the numbers are dropping. All right. I'm not going to waste time on this. It's time for me to stop digging around with you guys. Okay. If you miss it, you miss it. Oh, love to India. Okay, well, that's wonderful. I don't know if the word Jabi means anything to you. Okay. I'm back in the introduction. Let me take some more drugs. You know, I like drugs. That's what got me out of here. Uh-oh. Here I go again. This stuff is really good. It's really powerful. I'm going to see if I can get to at least 30 pages. And we can do a part 3. You like the Jaguar. That's great. Jaguar's the greatest. She deserves a chance. I don't know what to tell you guys, but I'm about ready. You guys are ready to get down and jam? Really? Okay, I think I've had enough drugs. Propofol is the best, but you know, I don't want to go to sleep. I can't do anything about what they do. The people tamper with my website. So before we start, I want to make this absolutely clear. I'm going to get a new mixer. I have one, but it's not good enough. I'm going to get a microphone, but I want you to get something, and don't ever forget this. You don't really have freedom of speech if you don't already know that. And people tamper with people's channels. So something as basic as reading a book is a problem for people. And they don't want people thinking. So if I'm getting people to think, then they don't want you to hear what I'm saying. No matter what I'm saying. If I said love everybody, they don't want you to hear it from me. And there are a lot of people that are shadow banned. So if you tell me my voice is off, I can't do anything about it. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. So if people were really tired of this stuff, they would go after and say, why do people bother people? Why don't they have freedom of speech? Why is it that some people can have nudity and guns and threaten to mass murder people, and they don't have any problems on the internet? I'm not doing anything like that, and they don't allow you to hear or get my notifications. It's probably because they want people to kill and get hurt. I'm not going to waste more time on that. If you don't know that by now, you need help. It is 10:22. And I'm going to go. I'm on page 5 of the introduction. And I'm Dr. Randy Short. This is the Angry Black Men's Book Channel. This is part 2 of When Rape Was Legal by Rachel, why am I forgetting this broad's name? And I know it, Feinstein. It's because I keep thinking of the woman from California. All right. So, whew. I'm on page 5 of the introduction of that book. The race of the victim clearly affected the ability to convict someone of rape as well. White men who are convicted of raping white women receive sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years in prison or execution, while rape by a white man against a black woman was not generally viewed as a crime. Some states allow castration of black men as punishment for raping white women. Moreover, black men who are accused of raping white women were sentenced to death through lynching, and for some years after the Civil War. For some years after the end of the Civil War. The definition of rape was used by white men carrying out these lynchings was loose and often based on little evidence reflecting the highly discriminatory protections offered by the criminal justice system. The inconsistent use of the term rape and the failure of the legal system and white-dominated culture to recognize forced sex upon enslaved black women and men as rape complicates the analysis of this topic. Previous research on rape of enslaved women further confounds this analysis. Many historians today use the language that minimizes the rape of black women and white men's responsibility and the perpetuation of this violence. It is common for historians to rely on phrases like sexual relations, committed miscegenation, seduced girls, or patronized prostitutes to refer to this rape. This language maintains an illusion of white virtue by
by disguising the violent behavior of white men. However, a handful of historians do refer to sexual relations between slave masters and enslaved men and women as rape. In doing so, they emphasize that white American history and white male identity is deeply intertwined with sexual violence. The rape of black women is increasingly referred to in scholarship on race, gender, and slavery. However, this topic continues to be underdeveloped. Scholarship analyzing sexual violence during slavery has taken a variety of scopes and perspectives. For instance, some slavery scholars have argued that rape was rare, while many historians and former slaves refute this notion. Due to the changing definitions of rape, the lack of legal protection afforded to slaves, and the hesitancy among individuals and historians to refer to incidents as rape, the magnitude of sexual violence carried out by white men against enslaved black women has been widely overlooked. Scholars who analyze interracial relationships during the 18th and 19th centuries have pointed to individual cases in which white men wanted more than just sex from the black woman with whom they were sexually engaged. For instance, Susan Hunt, a free black woman, and Nathan Sire, a wealthy white man, remained unmarried in order to live together with their 3 children. Sayer meticulously drafted a will to ensure the estate would go to Susan Hunt, as opposed to being overturned by relatives who would likely attempt to claim that he was not of sound mind when drafting the will. The family history of Susan Hunt and the records of various divorce cases and inheritance disputes involving white men who attempted to guarantee the transfer of their property to black women or their mixed-race children demonstrate a variety of family structures and relationships between blacks and whites existed during slavery. While these cases substantiate that some white slaveholders cared for enslaved black women with whom they were involved and were not solely interested in sexual exploitation, it is important to recognize that much of the sexual interaction that occurred during slavery were through law-backed force and coercion. Arguably, consensual sex between free white men and enslaved black women was not possible due to the power differential inherent in their relationship. These particular cases should not confuse the fact that many people attempted to conceal incidents of rape and sexual violence through euphemisms for rape and coercion. During slavery, white men and women failed to view sexual violence against enslaved black women as a form of violence. Modesty regarding sexual discourse was typical of the period, with minimal explicit descriptions of sexual acts or rape in order to preserve the white social norms and decorum. Nevertheless, the emphasis on modesty likely served a variety of white male interests, one of which being the ability to evade responsibility for sexual coercion and rape through the lack of details of a sexual encounter and the use of euphemisms. The terminology often placed blame on the enslaved women for their sexual involvement, thus freeing white men from their responsibility. For example, the terms concubine, prostitute, Jezebel, wench, and mistress were common ways of alluding to enslaved black women who were sexually involved with white men. Many of these terms carried allusions of hypersexuality and sexual deviance that reduced black women to the stereotype image of their sexuality while shifting responsibility away from white men and onto black women. Euphemistic language provided a strategy for concealing white men's sexual behavior and responsibility for sexual coercion with enslaved black women, an essential dimension of this coercive relationship. Indeed, the social approval or disapproval often depended more on whether or not a man was able to conceal his sexual misconduct with enslaved women than from avoiding the behavior altogether, since this allowed white men to maintain the image of themselves as upstanding members of society. Euphemisms that insisted that the concealment of rape add to the complexity involved in studying the rape of enslaved black women by white men. Intersectionality and the system of racism theory. Despite the difficulty involved in analyzing rape during slavery due to the absence of historical records on this sensitive topic, as well as the euphemisms that permeate the records that do exist, scholars such as Bell Hooks, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Patricia Hill Collins, and Kimberly Crenshaw provide crucial analyses and a theoretical foundation from which to develop our understanding of sexual violence against black women. Moreover, systemic racism theory and the white racial frame offer a framework for explaining the significance of the behaviors, institutions, and worldviews that emerged out of slavery and act as foundation for our present-day society. Systemic racism theory recognizes rape against enslaved black women as a critical form of domination that supports the oppression of people of color for the benefit of whites. Likely the legally protected economic exploitation of slavery, such as the financial benefits that whites gained from the labor of enslaved people, as well as from the purchasing and selling of slaves. Rape was a form of oppression that was legally permitted for white men against enslaved black women and men. Rape of enslaved women was profitable in the sense that the children became valuable property and future laborers for whites. Additionally, this sexual violence was valuable for non-material reasons. These non-material dimensions of sexual violence will be developed in this book. Systemic racism theory explains that racism is embedded within the current social institutions based on their foundation in slavery. At the heart of this theory, Fagan emphasizes that the history of the economic exploitation by whites against people of color and the legal institutions that supported this oppression. For instance, the unjust enrichment of whites and the unjust impoverishment of blacks began during the colonization, established a deep foundation within U.S. slavery. This extensive period of U.S. history lasted hundreds of years, followed by continued legal support for racial oppression, economic exploitation, and political disfranchisement through Jim Crow segregation, such as the legal support for different facilities, schools, and job opportunities based on one's race. Wealth, status, and power generated through slavery has been passed on to future generations, reproducing racial inequality long after slavery and legal segregation. The United States only recently legalized racial oppression with the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, making this oppression and the effects thereof a lived memory for anyone over the age of 60. Because the history of racial oppression is the history of the development of the United States' most important and powerful institutions, it cannot be overlooked, given that it significantly shapes our present-day society. Moreover, we often deny the impact of this history due to the white racial frame or worldview that whites developed alongside our social institutions in order to rationalize embedded systemic racism. The white racial frame encompasses narratives, ideologies, imagery, emotions, inclinations to discriminate, and stereotypes that cast whites in a favorable view and their actions of oppression as justified against the negative framing of people of color. Throughout the book, the term framing is frequently used specifically in reference to the white racial frame. When developing systemic racial theory, the white racial frame, the racialized oppression worldview founded in slavery, must be understood as intersectional. Intersectionality is a term encompassing theories which acknowledges that various forms of oppression, including race, gender, class, sexuality, and others, intersect, creating distinct experiences of systematic oppression and discrimination. The concept of intersectionality evolved out of social movements beginning in the 1960s and was eventually coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and her influential work. Later systematic gendered racism theory was established to analyze the way in which racism and sexism intersect in institutions such as the economy, whereby women of color are attracted in particular careers and experience unique forms of discrimination. Like systemic gendered racism theory, this book combines systemic racism theory, white racial frame, and intersectionality in order to analyze the various roles involved in sustaining the widespread rape of enslaved black women carried out by white men. Intersectionality recognizes black women suffered many unique forms of oppression under slavery owing to their location at the intersection of the institutions of racism, sexism, and enslavement. For instance, both black men and women were framed as hypersexual. However, black men were often stereotyped as aggressive and forceful, while black women were stereotyped as seductive and promiscuous. Racially, black women were expected to be strong physical laborers, while their sex was perceived to render them suitable for domestic tasks and reproductive labor, often forcing them to carry out distinct roles from their male counterparts. Because black women were framed as capable of domestic duties and less threatening than black men, They were more likely to be given work to occupy white spaces such as the slave master's home. Here, whites were able to supervise black women's behavior more carefully, and white men had increased sexual access to them. The white racial framing of black women placed a high expectation on them and allowed whites to exploit a variety of forms of their labor, creating unique experiences from their black male counterparts. For example, one anonymous woman gave birth to twins while she was enslaved. The next day, her master told her to go over to his house and scrub it from front to back. After scrubbing 2 rooms, she felt very unwell and had to lie down. The white master was enraged to find out that later that his wife had assisted this young woman by allowing her to rest while another enslaved person finished cleaning for her. He got mad and beat his wife, then went out and tied the poor colored woman to the whipping pole and beat her unmerciful. He left her tied up until he returned from church, at which point she was found dead. The master claimed that laziness killed her. This tragic story is an example of the multiple forms of exploitation faced by enslaved women, ranging from reproductive to physical labor. This example also sheds light on the complex position of white women and the role they played in the abuses of enslaved women and men. While the white woman described above put herself at risk to assist enslaved women, many white women sought to avoid these confrontations. In particular, white women's responses to rape of enslaved black women elucidate that role of which I have termed in intermediate groups, but in reinforcing systemic intersectional oppression. These groups have a degree of privilege and status over some, while they are simultaneously subordinate to others. From their position within an intersectional hierarchy, they experience incentives to perpetuate oppression against those beneath them, as well as their own subordination. Translation, they ain't your allies, dumbass women. This concept draws on W.B. Du Bois's psychological wage of whiteness and Collins' matrix of domination to understand the way in which institutions of oppression mutually construct one another. The psychological wage of whiteness refers to the privileges associated with being white that encourage poor whites to see themselves as superior to blacks. Based on the perception of white superiority, poor whites refrain from uniting with blacks despite shared economic interests. Similarly, during slavery, white women often failed to see the relationship between their own oppression and that of enslaved women due to the benefits in white femininity they desired, such as relative power over enslaved men and women, protection from the court system, and status as white women. The wage of whiteness was not equivalent for white men and women due to the differences in access to the economy, politics, property, and several other privileges. Instead, white women experienced incentives in white femininity which encouraged them to reproduce the subordination of enslaved women as well as their own oppression within white sexism. The intersectional nature of whiteness demonstrates the central way in which institutions of oppression reproduce one another in a matrix of domination. The matrix of domination refers to the way in which institutions of oppression like racism, sexism, and classism are organized within a given society to support and sustain each other. Because institutions of oppression are intricately and constantly constructing one another, eradicating one form of oppression requires the dismantling of all forms. This book will build on Collins' concept of the matrix of domination, demonstrating how institutions of oppression work to reinforce one another and reduce resistance through incentives and institutions like white femininity and white masculinity. The current analysis contributes to the intersectional theory broadly by focusing on the perpetuation of privilege and power of the dominant group, whites. Much intersectional theory and research has been analyzed the experiences of oppression of women of color, which is central to the intersectionality theory. This intersectional theorizing began with women of color whose experiences inform theory in unique and crucial ways. The current study focuses primarily on the development and reproduction of intersectional power for white men and women through the sexual exploitation of black women. This approach complements the important work previously done on intersectionality by analyzing the cultural and structural strategies and incentives for enacting and upholding white intersectional power and privilege. Moreover, the combining this intersectional lens with systemic racism theories, emphasis on slavery as a basis for the present day institutions of oppression, this work contributes to these theories by demonstrating the historical foundation for a white racial framing that is intersectional or employed differently based on the race and gender, and the unique intersectional roles that white women and men play in the continued construction of oppression. Conclusion. Under slavery, black women regularly experienced forms of abuse and oppression that were largely unique from their black male counterparts because of their gendered status. Slave masters could exploit the reproductive labor of enslaved women as well as their manual labor. Routine rape and sexual exploitation can be understood as distinguishing experiences for black women within slavery, shaping the way in which whites frame their status as black women. Furthermore, this force simultaneously molded the understanding of what it meant to be a white man or a white woman in the early century of the United States. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white men was supported and encouraged by the legal system. This legal and cultural context created an opportunity to perform white masculinity through sexual power and domination of enslaved women. The effects of this legal and cultural foundation continue to shape the experiences and white racial framing of black women today, who are often viewed as sexualized commodities to be used for the benefit of white men and undeserving of protection from the courts from violence and rape. This book examines the role that sexual violence played in the construction and perpetuation of white masculinity and white femininity by first examining motivations for white men to engage in the rape of enslaved black women. This rape was not merely the result of sexual desire and opportunity for white men or simply a form of punishment and racial domination, but instead encompassed all these dimensions as part of the identity of white masculinity. Additionally, this text highlights the significant role that white women played in facilitating sexual violence against enslaved black women through a variety of responses and at times through their lack of response to the action of white men in their lives. When Rape Was Legal is divided into 6 chapters and ultimately demonstrates that widespread sexual violence against enslaved black women was a form of oppression used to perform white masculinity and reinforce an intersexual hierarchy. Additionally, white women played a vital role by facilitating this sexual violence and perpetuating the subordination of themselves and those subordinate to them. Chapter 2 delves into perspectives of formerly enslaved black men and women with regard to sexual violence carried out by white men, using the Works Progress Administration slave narratives, autobiographies, and speeches of former slaves. Those who witnessed the sexual violence firsthand explain the motives of white men, including breeding, punishment, sexual gratification, white masculine performance, and male bonding. The perpetuation of white privilege and the reinforcement of black subordination permeates each of these explanations, highlighting the way in which sexual violence was used not only to preserve male or racial dominance, but also as a part of defining white masculinity. In addition to explaining the white man's sexual violence, this chapter describes the frequent resistance carried out by enslaved black women. Black women's resistance is an essential dimension of the sexual violence they experience because it offers clear evidence that the sexual relations were indeed acts of violence and rape, and it reflects the agency of enslaved black women and men. Using data from diaries, newspaper slave narratives, and trial pamphlets, Chapter 3 demonstrates how white men learned to sexually violate enslaved black women from members of their families and were encouraged by the norms associated with white masculinity to engage in this violence as part of the process I've termed as intergenerational transmission of white masculinity, which builds on Joe Fagan's concept of intergenerational transmission of wealth. The intergenerational transmission of white masculinity refers to a process wherein white parents teach the norms of white privilege and masculinity to their sons in ways that include the exploitation of those subordinate to them. In addition to the fact that sexual violence was learned and encouraged, Chapter 3 describes the practices white men engaged in when sexually violating enslaved women. White men reportedly offered gifts to enslaved women, but resorted to physical force if the gifts were not accepted. They also referred to enslaved black women as prostitutes and demonstrated a preference for lighter skinned women. These behaviors were described as techniques to ensure the stability of the intersectional hierarchy and to uphold the image of white men as moral and superior despite their sexual behaviors. Chapter 4 uses diaries from wealthy white women, autobiographical slave narratives, Works Progress Administration slave narratives, and slave interviews collected by Benjamin Drew to describe the role of white women in sexual violence against enslaved black women. White women enabled and encouraged sexual violence of enslaved black women by white men, perpetuating white dominance and black subordination. Motivated by the privileges associated with white femininity, white women engaged in several practices that reinforced the oppression of enslaved black women who were victims of sexual violence. As reported by former slaves, after learning of sexual violence that many of their white husbands were engaging in, white women often blamed and punished enslaved women who were being sexually violated by physically harming them, summoning these women to another owner, and thus separating them from their families or harassing them in other ways. White women's role in the sexual violence against enslaved black women highlights a primary theoretical contribution of this book by describing the way in which oppression functions intersectionally. Those groups with some degree of power and privilege who simultaneously experience significant oppression, such as white women, are referred to as intermediate groups, who play a critical function in reinforcing intersectional oppression. In this unique position of privilege and oppression, white women experience incentives to reinforce their own oppression as well as the oppression of those subordinate to them. During slavery, white women held privilege and power in whiteness while concurrently experiencing substantial oppression as women. The experience of white women in regard to sexual violence against enslaved black women by white men demonstrates a central mechanism for explaining how intersectional oppression operates. Chapter 5 incorporates an analysis of divorce petitions submitted by white women during the slavery era. These petitions involve white women accusing their husbands of adultery with enslaved black women and reflect the way in which the language was used to reinforce the intersectional hierarchy and intersecting degrees of privilege throughout that hierarchy. Although gender norms associated with white femininity perpetuate the white woman's dependence and subordination to white men, during the divorce petitions, white women consistently relied on these norms to achieve their goals, reflecting the challenges associated with occupying an intermediary status within the intersectional hierarchy. In addition, white women avoided language of sexual violence or rape, overlooking the experiences and needs of enslaved black victims of this violence, and instead reinforcing notions of white supremacy and the right of white men to sexual activity with women. This chapter not only adds insights into the role that white women played in sexual violence against enslaved black women by emphasizing the language within the court system, but also elaborates on the theoretical contributions in this book by describing the difficulty for the intermediate group to achieve status and power outside the confines of intersectional hierarchy. Chapter 6 highlights the connections between rape during slavery and the present-day violence against black women and white racial framing of whites. Today, many white men evade harsh sentences for sexual violence against women, and masculinity continues to be performed through the sexual exploitation of women. White racial framing of black women as promiscuous lingers on as an excuse for rape. The analysis of the sexual violence against enslaved black women by white men is crucial for the understanding of the present-day racial and gender identities of whites and blacks and the behaviors which reinforce oppression. Whew! All that verbiage. Oh, wow. I'm finally in chapter 2. Are you guys there? Anybody here? Okay, we've made good progress. Oh, hell, I'm about to burn through chapter 2. Okay, here we go. The voices of black women and men. Why sexual violence by white men was rampant during slavery. Louisa and Sam Everett were born into slavery near Norfolk, Virginia. Growing up on different plantations, they did not meet and marry until early adulthood when they were purchased by a depraved slave owner known as Big Jim McLean for a combination of reasons including breeding, humiliation, and control, and perverse sexual gratification. Big Jim gained sexual pleasure as a voyeur. This practice was soon targeted at Sam and Louisa. He forced them to have sexual intercourse while he acted as an observer, enjoying their humiliation and powerlessness. The sexual violence was further exacerbated when Master McLean invited his friends to join him in this act, thus intensifying the degradation. Sam and Louisa reported that he enjoyed these orgies very much and often entertained his friends in this manner, quite often as he and his guests would engage in these debaucheries, choosing for themselves the prettiest of the young women. Sometimes they forced unhappy husbands and lovers of their victims to look on. Slave narratives like that of Louisa and Sam Everett, as well as the autobiographies and speeches of many former slaves, elucidate several reasons why white men engaged in sexual violence against enslaved women. Sexual gratification was clearly a theme in these documents. However, several narratives describe additional significant incentives for the sexual violence. The rape of enslaved women became normalized for white men and therefore unquestioned. It served to control, humiliate, and degrade enslaved women and men, increase the slave labor and property by impregnating the women, and provide an avenue for white male bonding and white masculine performance, as seen by Master McLean inviting friends to join in his sexual violence. Each of these motives is closely intertwined with white privilege and the reinforcement of black subordination. Through this sexual violence was clearly used to preserve male dominance and racial dominance. It can also be understood more specifically as helping to shape and define white masculinity. While many former enslaved men and women describe the constant threat of rape for enslaved women and the associated benefits for white men, several also remark on the resilience of enslaved women who resist and even threaten the system of white male domination. Even before, this section, routine sexual abuse on slave ships, breaking the enslaved women into submission. Are you guys ready? Let me have a dash of aqua here. Even before arriving in North America and the Caribbean, African women were subjected to sexual violation on board the ships carrying them to various colonized lands. Robert Shufelt, an army surgeon in the late 1800s, frequently traveled by ship to several countries. He observed many African women entering North America already impregnated by white men who had captured them, noting that the crossing of two races commenced at the very onstart of the vile slavery trade that fetched them thither. This sexual violence and other abuses that took place on slave ships functioned to indoctrinate and transform Africans from free people into submissive, obedient slaves. Some enslaved women and men were tortured and murdered as means of instilling terror and compliance in others. Witnessing and experiencing the consequences for disobedience ensured that enslaved men and women understood the limited options for resisting white men prior to arriving in North America, in addition to creating marketable slaves who would comply with domestic duties and the demands for labor through fear. Sexual violence inflicted upon women on board ships taught these enslaved women that their role in relationship to white men would eventually purchase and sexually exploit and rape them. Olada Equiano was an enslaved man who worked primarily on ships for the British Navy. He was one of the fortunate few that was eventually able to purchase his freedom. He became an abolitionist and wrote an autobiographical narrative which offers insight into the abuses that occurred during the voyage from Africa. Among the many cruelties that slavery detailed in his autobiography, Equiano describes a routine and constant practice of raping and sexually violating enslaved women on board the ships. Specifically, Equiano witnessed the behavior of clerks and other whites who committed violent depredations on the chastity of female slaves. Furthermore, he notes that these white men would gratify their brutal passion with females not 10 years old. And these abominations, some of them would do with such scandalous excess that one of our captains discharged a mate and others on that account. The rape of enslaved black women and girls was a constant and accepted behavior among white men aboard these ships. Captains discharging some men because of such scandalous excess while allowing most to carry out routine sexual violence against these young girls reflects the very low standards for white men's strong family values, right? Sexual behavior in regard to enslaved black girls. This low bar established by the captain reveals a wide array of sexual violence deemed acceptable by the authority figure on board. The widespread sexual violence against enslaved black girls and women continued once they were purchased by white slaveholders, persisting as normalized behavior. Sexual violence against enslaved black women provided an avenue for white men to exert their power, control, and sexual domination. While white men clearly exerted their power through the act of rape, they also demonstrated their control by threatening and instilling a collective awareness among enslaved women and men with regard to potential sexual violence and the consequences for resisting. In turn, the collective awareness paved the way for continued rape. The Work Progress Administration slave narratives offer insight into the collective awareness and prevalent rape experienced by enslaved women. These narratives include interviews with formerly enslaved individuals who were collected by the federal government in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project. It should be noted that the majority of these interviews for these projects were white, and they relied on poor interview techniques, including the use of leading questions and revising or deleting the participants' words. Many participants did not trust the interviewers, which influenced their responses. While not without methodological flaws, these narratives do provide rare insights into the experiences and perspectives of formerly enslaved women and men. W.L. Bost gave an insightful interview for the Works Progress Administration Slave Narratives when he was 88 years old. Bost explains that while enslaved women may have appeared to consent to sexual relations with their masters, the reality was they had minimal options for consent and were afraid to resist. Quote, "Plenty of the colored women have children by white men. She knows better than not to do what he say. Then they take them very same children, what they have done to what they have their own blood, and make slaves out of them. If the mistress find out that she raised revolution, but she can hardly find out. White men not going to tell, and the nigger women are always afraid to. They just go on hoping that things won't always be this way always." Close quote. Boss points out the danger involved in refusing a white man's sexual desire or reproductive desires. His comment signals a collective understanding among enslaved women with regard to punishments associated with refusing sex with a white man. Because this collective understanding, in addition to blatant threats from white men, in many cases, some enslaved women may not have appeared to outwardly resist the sexual abuses they endured. And while rare cases of comparatively voluntary relationship between white men and enslaved black women during slavery have been documented, the existence of a collective knowledge regarding the potential punishments associated with refusing sexual intercourse make it unlikely that most enslaved women felt that they had a choice in these sexual encounters. Fear of physical injury, threats to harm children and family members, and the threat of being sent to another plantation separated from one's family were all used to ensure that enslaved women obeyed the sexual orders of their masters. Throughout the interviews and narratives of former enslaved men and women reportedly described the various forms of punishment associated with resisting the master's assaults. In addition to the actual threat of rape, the collective knowledge of these punishments for offering resistance functioned as a form of terrorism, which controlled enslaved women's behavior. Enslaved black women could be coerced into sex with white men based on implicit threat without the master actually having to threaten or physically force her. As Madison, Jefferson, and others recounted, women who refused to submit themselves to the brutal desires of their owners are repeatedly whipped to subdue their virtual repugnance. And in most instances, this hellish practice is but too successful. When it fails, women are frequently sold off to the South. White men employed this punishment to uphold their power and, more specifically, their sexual dominance and entitlement over enslaved women and their bodies. William J. Anderson remarks on the repetitive sexual violation of enslaved black women as well. Anderson, born in Hanover County, Virginia, in 1811, to a free mother and enslaved father. After his father passed away, his mother hired him out to a slaveholder who eventually sold him. In his narrative, he writes of his personal experiences in slavery, the brutal treatment he received from slaveholders, 8 times he was sold, and the common experience of sexual abuse that enslaved black women endured. Quote, "This is another curse of slavery, concubinage, and illegitimate connections, which is carried on to an alarming extent in the far South. A poor slave man who lives close by his wife is permitted to visit her, but very seldom, and other men, both white and colored, cohabit with her. It is undoubtedly the worst place of incest and bigamy in the world. A white man thinks nothing of putting a colored man out to carry the 4-row and carry on the same sport with the colored man's wife at the same time," close quote. Anderson points out the frequency with which rape and sexual violence occurred in the South. The alarming extent of the sexual violence suggests that the practice was a significant form of social interaction between white men and enslaved black women. The routine practice of rape being carried out by white men against enslaved women distinguished each in terms of racial and gender status, reaffirming the dominance of white men and the degraded and sexualized status of black women. Another autobiographical narrative, Henry Bibb, writes about his personal experiences and observations during slavery. According to Bibb, quote, "And it be known to the disgrace of our country that every slaveholder who is the keeper of a number of slaves of both sexes is also the keeper of a house or houses of ill fame. Licentious white men can and do enter at night or day, lodging in places of slaves, break up the bonds of affection in families, destroy all the domestic and social union for life, and all the laws of the country afford them no protection," close quote. In his account, Bibb also describes the routine practice of white men sexually exploiting enslaved black women without any consideration of their personal desires or their family relations. As a consequence of this frequent sexual violence, enslaved families were broken up and romantic ties were destroyed. Not only was the right of one's body and dignity stripped in the process of raping enslaved black women, but also one's relationships. The power and control derived from disrupting families and humiliating enslaved men and women are important explanations for sexual violence, which ensured the white men's power was respected, perpetuated, and increased. In turn, this helped to reinforce the construction of white masculinity as involving sexual domination over those subordinate to oneself. Power garnered through sexual control and humiliation, an attempt to perform white masculinity, is magnified in the case of some white men who use sexual violence as a form of entertainment and socializing with other white men. Louisa and Sam Everett, whose experiences with sexual violence were described in the opening of this chapter, were not alone in their experiences. The Everetts describe over 100 slaves who were mated indiscriminately without any regard for family unions on the plantation. Big Jim entertained his friends by allowing them to rape the enslaved women he owned while their loved ones watched. The degradation of enslaved black men as husbands or family members, unable to prevent this sexual abuse, offered a way to demonstrate the sexual dominance as part of what it meant to be a white man. Moreover, white men could bond over their shared experiences of the sexual violation of the enslaved black woman, since this behavior was only allowed for white men, distinguishing them from any other group in society. Bonding among white men strengthened their identity as a racialized, gendered group, while reinforcing their sexual violence against enslaved women as normal. Moreover, Jim could benefit socially and psychologically through the sense that he was observed enacting his dominance over others in front of his white male peers, the desire to impress other white men, and bond with them through degradation of others reflects the role that sexual violence played in constructing white masculinity as an identity based on sexual and physical abasement of others. Breeding. Sexual violence against enslaved black women not only provided white men with an avenue for demonstrating their sexual power in front of other men, but also offered a means of reinforcing economic dominance, a key dimension of the Southern elite white masculinity. Rose Williams was enslaved in Texas and purchased in order to bear children. She was forced to reproduce with an enslaved man, Rufus. When Rose approached the master's wife to request help, she was merely told to oblige to the master's wishes. Thanks, feminist. Recognized that she would not receive any assistance. Rose resisted this forced encounter on her own. When Rufus came to her cabin that night, she grabbed a poke and told him to get out before she hurt him. He left that night, but the next day the master called Rose, telling her he had paid big money for her because he wanted her to beget him children. He threatened her with a whipping at the stake. While this threat left her with little real choice but to comply, she refused to marry another man or have any more children ever again, explaining that one experience am enough. Like sexual power, economic success and dominance are central dimensions of white male masculinity, which could be achieved through the exploitation of enslaved women and men's bodies in reproductive labor. Several records of former slaves describe the economic incentive for white men to participate in rape. Scholars like Thelma Jennings and Dorothy Roberts have argued that rape by white masters against enslaved black women, as well as forced sexual intercourse that the masters insisted should take place between enslaved men and women, served an economic function. These acts were used to breed more enslaved children in order to increase the master's assets. Codified in the law, white men had an economic incentive to force sex upon enslaved men and women and could rape them. Since all children born of enslaved women were legally considered slaves, U.S. law enabled white men to sexually exploit enslaved black women for economic advantage with no legal consequences or liabilities to themselves. The slave breeding hypothesis has been debated by historians. Some argue that masters anticipated enslaved men and women could generate to 5 to 6% of their profit, thus incentivizing them to maximize their slave fertility. This helps explain why enslaved men and women were able to have children were valued at between 1/6 and 1/4 more than women who are unable to bear children. However, other scholars refute the notion that slave breeding occurred, claiming that the demographic data and estimates of cost-benefit analysis suggest that this would not have been commonplace. I disagree. However, estimated costs of the practice of forcing enslaved women and men to reproduce for the economic benefit of white men is widely discussed by those that experience and witness this behavior firsthand. In former slave diaries and narratives like that of Rose Williams, Hilliard Yellowday, John Cole, and many others, the economic incentive for white men to engage in this form of sexual violence against enslaved men and women is evident. In his 1937 Works Progress Administrative Interview, John Cole, a man who had been enslaved in Georgia, describes the practice of passing enslaved young black men from one plantation to the next in order to reproduce slave laborers. He explained that when an enslaved person was noted for raising up strong black bucks, he would be sent out as a species of circuit rider to the other plantations. In particular, these enslaved men would be sent to places where an overplus of enslaved women were held, and he would be married off again, time and again. This practice was considered thrifty, and that it saved the master from having to purchase new stock. Are y'all with me? How y'all liking this? Quote, an anonymous slave was interviewed in Augusta, Georgia recounts. The market was in the middle of Broad and Center Streets. Everybody wanted a woman who could have children fast. They would always ask if you were a good breeder, and if so, they would buy you at your word. But if you had already had too many children, they would say you weren't much good. If you hadn't had any children, your master would tell them you were strong and healthy and a fast worker. In North Carolina, Hilliard Yellowday observed her slave master relying on similar practices for his own economic gains. His fortune was his slaves, she explained. He had so many slaves he didn't know all their names. He did not need to purchase many enslaved men and women because he resorted to raising his own slave. As a general custom, Yellowday observed that enslaved young girls approaching the age of 12 or 13 were expected to begin bearing children for the master. The repetition of accounts like this from individuals who were enslaved in a number of southern states testifies to the fact that white men commonly engaged in this dehumanizing practice. When recounting the narratives of this forced reproduction, individuals frequently describe the behavior using parallels to breeding animals, accentuating the dehumanizing nature of this violence. For example, William Ward, who was formerly enslaved in Georgia, equates the treatment of enslaved black women by white men to the experience of cattle. At one point, his master told Ward, if my wife had been good looking, I would never sleep with her again because he'd kill me and take her and raise the children off of her. White men would take women from husbands to breed just like they do cattle. They always keep men penned up and they use us like stud horses. Tennessee, Sylvia Watkins related to this forced reproduction to breeding pigs. A large enslaved man and woman would be forced together by the master, and if the woman did not have children, she would be put on the block and sold. Another one would be purchased in order to raise children to make money the same way that we raise pigs to sell. The reproductive exploitation and dehumanization of enslaved women and men for economic gain is evident in these interviews. In order to control, humiliate, dehumanize enslaved black women and men, were in ways which white men could exert their sexual and economic dominance simultaneously and thereby reaffirm their position at the top of an intersectional hierarchy wherein they maintain status and power as not only white, but more specifically as white men above all other racial and gender groups. Moreover, the white racial framing of themselves as superior was reinforced through this economic and social success. Despite the work that white men engaged in to dehumanize enslaved black people in order to maintain their white male identities and status, many examples of resistance and counterframing emerged through the narratives and diaries as well, reflecting the instability of the intersectional hierarchy and the agency of enslaved women and men. Let me see how close am I to... Oh, wow. Harriet Jacobs, the first woman in the United States to write a fugitive slave narrative, documents the sexual threats and violence carried out by white men and the resistance from black women she witnessed and experienced as an enslaved woman in North Carolina. Referring to herself as Linda Brent and her master, Dr. Norcom, as Mr. Flint, Jacobs concealed her identity in order to provide an authentic account of slavery. In her narrative, she reveals many of the experiences of life as an enslaved young girl. Despite the threats of sexual violence she regularly encountered, Jacob resisted Dr. Norcom's advances and white racial framing of black women in general. She writes about her feelings towards Dr. Norcom's reckless, craving, vicious nature, explaining, when he told me I was made for his use, made to obey his command in everything, that I was nothing but a slave, whose will must and should surrender to his. Never before had my puny arm felt half so strong. Instead of weakening her spirit, attempts by her master, Dr. Norcom, to subordinate her made Jacob feel stronger. Her impressive emotional response to the verbal violation and oppression of him reflects a strong counter-framing or an alternative to the dominant white racial frame that views people of color in terms of their humanity and tenacity while critiquing the notion of whites as superior. Contradictory to the white racial framing of the happy slaves in need of care from their white owners, Jacob expresses the dire circumstances she and so many others faced. Like Jacob's, formerly enslaved men and women expressed their anger and despair throughout their autobiographies, narratives, and speeches, and they reacted with resistance. In the previous example, Jacob's resistance is emotional and internal, in that she mentally decides to reject Dr. Norcom's attempts and subordinating and weakening her. In other moments, Jacobs resists verbally by telling Norcom's how she feels about him. Ultimately, she ran away, thus escaping slavery. Later wrote an account of her experiences to elucidate the truth about her feelings towards slavery, sexual abuse of enslaved women, and Dr. Norcom. The theme of resistance commonly appears in narratives, diaries, and manuscripts written by the formerly enslaved men and women. Despite the consistent threat of sexual violence that enslaved black women face due to their lack of legal protection and ability of white men to punish them severely for refusing sex, many black enslaved women resisted rape and other forms of physical abuse by their masters. Original records from the slavery era reflect several specific forms of physical and psychological resistance employed by enslaved black women and men, such as emotional resistance carried out by Jacobs. Other acts of resistance include parental encouragement to act verbally and physically refusing to participate in sexual activity with white men, poisoning their masters or their families, and running away. Each of these acts declares the dignity of these women and demonstrates their agency. Enslaved black women rejected stereotypes of black hypersexuality and promiscuity, reflecting the baselessness of this white racial framing, despite the framing of enslaved black women as desirous of sex with white men. These women were often willing to risk injury or even death in an attempt to avoid and resist rape by white men in their lives. Resistance by enslaved black women and men involved in courageous acts of defiance against the system of slavery and specific abuses associated with it. In turn, these reactions of white men to this resistance was violent. They responded with physical abuse and murder. They even brought women to court charging with attempting to poison or kill white family members. These reactions demonstrate the desperate desire of white men to maintain their power over their blacks. Lewis Clark, a former slave from Kentucky, who described the resistance he witnessed among enslaved women. In a speech in 1842 recorded by Lydia Maria Childs, Clark states, quote, "Now, if there was anything else but this, it would make a slave's life as bad as death. Just think for a minute how you would like to have your sisters and your wives and your daughters completely, teetotally, and altogether in the power of a master," close quote. He explained that many enslaved women are not allowed to respect herself and provide the example of his sister, a light-skinned woman who took more after her father, a complexion than he had. When she turned 16, her master sent for her. She cried and told her mother, who encouraged her to be decent, hold her head above such things if she could. When the master found out she had complained, he grew angry and sold her to another slave owner in Louisiana, where she eventually died of hard usage. They fucked her to death. They fucked her to death. Freakouts long before Diddy. And we don't deserve reparations. Strong family values. The hypocrisy of these goddamn phony-ass white evangelicals who have the nerve to lecture us about our family system. Hard usage. Despite her limited power, this young girl exerted her agency, thus reclaiming her dignity, exposing the myth of enslaved black women as hypersexual. Oh, wow. Because of legal constraints, enslaved black men were often unable to prevent the sexual violence perpetrated by white men without severe consequences. As a father, brother, husband, or friend, Clark notes how hard it was to witness his relatives being exploited sexually and how little he was able to help. His speech reflects the terror of sexual violence for all enslaved men and women. Clark's speech is also noteworthy because it includes examples of counterframing passed from enslaved parents to children. When his sister cried, her mother told her to hold up her head above such things if she could, thereby signaling a form of resistance against the master's attempt to degrade the girl through sexual violence. While the young girl may not have had control over many things in her life, she had agency over her frame of mind. Despite the sexual abuses she suffered, the fact she was able to carry herself with respect was to defy the will of the act, which was intended to strip her of any dignity. As Marcus explained, rape is one of the culture's many modes of feminizing women. The instructions of the mother in the previous passage demonstrate the desire to supersede the potential imprint of the black feminine victim on her daughter through her use of her disposition. A formerly enslaved woman who remains anonymous describes her resistance to her master's sexual advances and counterframing that coincided. She was interviewed in Augusta, Georgia by Louise Oliphant for the Federal Writers Project and described her master's sexual coercion of her as thus, quote, "My young master tried to go with me and, 'cause I would not go with him, he pretended I had done something and beat me. I fought him back because he had no right to beat me for not going with him. His mother got mad with me for fighting him back, and I told her why he beat me. Well, then she sent me to the courthouse to be whipped for fighting him." Close quotes. Your feminist allies, black women. You guys are still supporting this. You're doing this now. Kamala, all of this, Nancy Pelosi, Planned Parenthood. Damn. They use more agency then than what black women use today. Shame. Shame, shame, shame. Shame. In this excerpt, the woman refers to the sexual advancement of one of the sons of the plantation as references to the phrase "the young master." She turns to the mother for understanding and help. However, the woman's reaction is counterintuitive. Instead of a white woman of a household staying silent or stopping her son's behavior, she encourages his behavior, evidenced by her punishment of the enslaved woman who refused his advances. This white woman aligned her interests along racial and familial lines as opposed to gender, leading to the exacerbation of that enslaved woman's victimization. And it's still like that. When these bad things happen to black women, I don't hear no white women say nothing. And y'all running after them. I'm going to keep bringing that up. I hope I hurt some feelings. When y'all going to stop being disloyal to the collective? Oh, well, say her name. Bullshit. This passage deals with enslaved woman's strong perception of her rights were not being respected. Despite her position as a black woman and a slave compared to the position of the young master as free, the young white man, she asserts, had no right to. She had the right to refuse his advancements. This strong counter-framing implies that the mainstream white racial framing of her as an enslaved black woman and of her master has not been internalized. Instead, it had been resisting. During the interview, she provides additional evidence of her counter-framing. She continues, quote, "They would strap your clothes around your waist and have nothing but your naked part to whip. They didn't care about who saw your nakedness. Anyway, they beat me that day until I couldn't sit down. After they finished whipping me, they told me they needn't think about they'd done something by stripping me in front of all them folk, 'cause they had also stripped their mamas and sisters. God made us all, and he made us just alike." Even after the potential degradation and emotional physical pain she endured in being whipped while she was naked, this woman was still confident that her abusers had taken nothing from her. Her reaction to these abuses suggests that she had not internalized the white framing of her as subordinate. Even when the white men attempted to force this framing upon her through the act of stripping her, exposing her body to others, and physically whipping her, she retained a perception of herself as dignified and deserving of respect. Moreover, she expressed to her white abusers that in degrading her, they had also degraded themselves as well as all their white wives and daughters. This woman possessed such a strong counter framing that she affirmed this framing to the white men, verbally informing them of their lack of power over her personal identity and the power she held within herself to frame them negatively. Let me just stop here for a second. This woman that wrote this book is a Jew. I'm not mad about that. But these people that are fighting back, believe in God, folks. And I bring this up in all my conversations that the people on the leftists, they may seem like they're for, but there's almost no mention of God here. I've read some of these slave narratives, and these people talk about their religious beliefs. And it's the same thing I see where people talk about, they'll say Dr. Martin Luther King, but never Reverend, right? They won't deal with the fact that Medgar Evers is Church of God in Christ. There's always an effort to separate the religious foundations of the spirituality of black people from their resistance. And by the way, all the stupid-ass black consciousness people do the same thing because they're in line with these leftist people as to deny a place for belief in God, something transcendent. So these slaves are just getting all this inspiration to stand up because it's just there. If this were written about the Holocaust, they would tell you about their faith and how they were praying and all this other stuff. For black folks, because they're Protestant Christian, they hate Christ so much. They say Jews don't like people believe in Jesus Christ or the New Testament, right? Until whenever they do stuff, they remove that. The leftists, communists, they always do that. There's no space for that. Okay, so 100 years from now, let's say I become something significant. They'll talk about everything other than the fact I became a Christian when I was 4. I have a house full of Bibles. My dad's a minister. They come from generations of they'll take all of that away and just say, this guy just really had a strong bullshit. Y'all need to be clear about this, where this resistance came from. And as we don't have a strong concept of right or wrong or God now, look at how screwed we are as a collective. How did they have it then and we don't have it now? They believed in something, and these days, most black folk don't believe in a damn thing. Success and money, that's why they're mad with Jaguar Wright. And these masters who were raping these people were successful, and they had the Benjamins. We've become just like the masters. And they claim to be religious and believe something too. You can't prove it by me. So, just all of this stuff, they just start standing up in dignity and frame. All this secular shit. These people singing spiritual and stuff to get through the day. Were they singing klezmer music songs? Miss Feinstein? Y'all need to start understanding folks don't like the spirituality. There's a spiritual war against us. It's a struggle between wickedness and righteousness. But if you don't have a foundation, a concept of righteousness, you really can't fight. People are committing suicide and on all sorts of psychotropic drugs and falling apart in our community because we don't have any of the foundations that people in Cottonfield did. And even though this book gives all of this great detail, there's no mention of faith or what people believe in resistance. It just emerges. People just standing up because bullshit. Everybody has something they believe in. This is why we need to do our own history, and then you'll understand why people like me aren't in the academy. Because I would have embarrassed this broad. I would praise all the good stuff she got. This Harriet Jacobs that she's talking about, Harriet Jacobs, if you read half of her stuff, is talking about praying to God. All of that's left out. Just Harriet Jacobs is just standing up to this white dude. Oh no, she's just so smart. Solomon Northrop, Equiano Delana. If you start looking at all these people like folks in God, I mean, what you have. And you know what? They had that, and we don't want what they had. And we're doing a hell of a lot worse with a trillion times more. This woman possessed strong counterframing that she affirmed this framing to the white men, verbally informing that their own lack of power over her personal identity and the power she held within herself to frame them negatively. The verse from the Bible says, "Fear not he who can kill the body, but fear him who can kill the body and cast the soul into hell." Right? The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? These are very important passages to black folks, the Bible and those verses. And this is just all coming from the inside. This is just innate in people that just everything. Bullshit. Bullshit. It's still useful. Just understand the academy, the universities deny the existence of God. They're bastions of atheism and agnosticism. Well, there's something out there, right? Okay. So, that's why I bring it up. If you read my medical records on paper, I shouldn't be able to sit up. I shouldn't be able to walk. I should need to piss every 5 minutes. Have y'all noticed I haven't popped up to piss? And I've been here for an hour and 20 minutes. And they're saying, oh my God, you have prostate cancer. I need to like piss every 5 minutes. You didn't see me move. And I drank some water and such. And I drank upstairs. And I probably could do this another hour or so. Okay. It doesn't even make sense to the doctor. I have to see him in a couple of weeks. Waiting, well, what number will you let me infuse you in the behind? I don't think there is a number. In addition to reflecting agency, these acts of resistance accompanied by physical force from white men whose power and control were threatened. For instance, a former enslaved man from Georgia described an attractive girl who was enslaved with him. An overseer was crazy about her. However, her mother told him to stay away from all the overseers. Despite the young girl's attempt to evade the overseer, he would follow her closely while she worked until she almost went crazy. Eventually, she ran away, hiding out in another household for nearly 3 days until she was discovered by the master of the household. However, she escaped and stayed hid in the woods as long as she could before being forced to return to the plantation in order to avoid starvation. The overseer was angry she had run away and approached her again. She refused, telling him, flat-footed, she weren't going with him. He struck her on the head with the big end of his cowhide so hard it knocked her plumb crazy. As a result, she nearly drowned in a nearby lake, except her mother caught her. The girl engaged in many forms of resistance to avoid sexual violation from white men around her. The woman's mother enacted the first type of resistance, advising her daughter not to submit and encouraging the mental decision to resist as opposed to obeying the white men in her life. Heeding this advice, the young woman ran away, thus evading the overseer who was constantly following her. Later attempting to survive in the woods as opposed to submitting to the sexual desires of the overseer, she exhibited bravery and staunch resistance. She never where does this stuff come from, right? I mean, the Islamic suicide bomber is Muslim. It's Islam. Everybody, but black people, they just do it. She's lazy, or she's got an atheistic frame in which she looks at everything, so there's no God. I bet you this broad is atheistic. I'm gonna look her ass up. I bet you she's an atheist. And so the way that they look at stuff, I'm not saying you have to believe what the person does, but you can't pretend that they don't believe what they believe and say that you're being objective. See what I'm saying? And when she was talking about Crenshaw, who didn't, all these folks are lesbian, feminists, atheist, agnostic. They've got some great theories, but they never, ever recognize what about people's beliefs? What are their ideas? How do you ignore the ideology that just all this behavior occurs without ideas? Well, just your mama told you. Later, attempting to survive in the woods, opposed to submitting to the sexual desires of the overseer, she exhibited bravery and staunch resistance. Finally, she verbally resisted the overseer when he continued to approach her. As a punishment for resisting the sexual abuse, the young woman was severely physically harmed. In accounts from formerly enslaved men and women, physical force as punishment for resisting sex is common. One ultimately successful example of resistance was carried out by a girl in Maryland. Her story is told through an interview in Baltimore in the home of Richard Max, a former enslaved man. She was up for sale. One night, the slaver took her to his room to satisfy his bestial nature. She resisted his attempts and he attacked her. Eventually, she grabbed a knife and with it, she sterilized him. From the result of the injury, he died the next day. Although she was originally charged with murder, General Butler, hearing of it, sent troops to Charles County to protect her. By the way, this was during the Civil War. She was taken, sent troops to Charles County. That's where my family's from. There's a big Lancaster plantation there. I'm sorry, my ancestors were slaves. They wouldn't have did. God, it's disgusting. Later, she was taken to Washington where she was set free. This attack was the result of being good looking, for which a poor girl in Charles County paid the price Max added. There are several cases I could mention, but they are distasteful to me. Max not only used the term like force and coerce throughout his description of the event, which is rarely used in white accounts of sexual violence of enslaved black women by white men, but he also explains these tactics were not enough to stop white men from obtaining what they wanted. According to this interview, ultimately a woman involved was successful in evading rape and eventually gained her freedom. Moreover, in recounting her story, Richard Mack provides examples of resistant thinking. As opposed to accepting the fate of the woman he witnessed as maintaining a view of white men as pure and honorable, he critically describes acts of white men as cruel and inhuman, bestial in nature of their behavior. Max continued in his counter-framing. When speaking generally of the people he observed under slavery, let me explain to you very plain without prejudice one way or another. I've had many opportunities and a chance to watch white men and women in my long career. Colored women have many hurdles to fight to protect themselves from the assault of employers, white male servants, and by white men many times not being able to protect themselves and fear of losing their position. In this passage, Max describes black women as agents who fight to protect themselves from assault. Rather than viewing these women as merely passive victims, he recognizes the hard battles they undergo to protect themselves, while acknowledging that at times they are unable to do so because of their limited power. Whew. Routine sexual violence and rape of enslaved black women is evidenced in various primary data sources, including narratives from the Works Progress Administration, autobiographic narratives, and speeches. Because of sexual violence by white men against enslaved black women was widespread, it can be understood as a social norm for this period. The repetition of this normalized behavior helped to racialize and gender black women and men, as well as white men and women. White men engaged in rape and forced sex of enslaved women and men for their own sexual, psychological, and social pleasure. Some instances of rape will clearly reflect the use of this violence as punishment of enslaved women and men. However, coerced sex and rape cannot merely be understood as punishment or sexual gratification for whites. Rather, this sexual violence provided more complex advantages for white men, such as white male bonding and performance of white masculinity, including economic, social, and physical dominance, as well as intersected specifically on the bodies of enslaved black women. The racializing and gendering of themselves as free to carry out their sexual desires and physical dominance on subordinated enslaved individuals, and to gain economically through the process reaffirm their status as successful white men. In contrast, the racializing and gendering of enslaved black women who were subjected often simultaneously to sexual, reproductive, and economic exploitation in order for white men to gain highlights the dependence of white masculinity as an identity on the oppression of enslaved black women and their use of rape to achieve their white masculinity. Let me just stop for a minute Diddy and Jay-Z are allegedly guilty of doing the same thing we're tripping about what white men did. If we can be honest with each other. If we can be honest with each other. If we can be honest with each other. These are successful, wealthy black men who are basically bonding with black men, raping and abusing black women and men. They're acting out this same thing. It's disgusting. And what's more disgusting is we, because these guys are successful, find Jaguar totally distasteful. And yet we can embrace people who supposedly like us doing the same stuff that we find so repellent when other people do it. We should have one standard. Wrong is always wrong. Right is always right. Shall I read a little bit more? Because I got it. I can read a little bit more. Let me see how long this chapter is. Because, I can pick this up tomorrow. Well, this chapter isn't that long. Oh, this book isn't that big. If I do this, I'll be halfway through it. Y'all want me to stop? Let me see that. 12 here and 24. Y'all want me to try one more chapter? Because I can do part 3, and we'll knock this out tomorrow. What y'all say? Y'all want me to read on? Somebody communicate. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Okay, there are 2 over here. So there's 15, 18. There is 22. So we've got 42 people. What do you guys say? Y'all want to hear some more? More? How many more yeses? Okay, at least let me get, how many likes do I have? I need likes. Okay, likes. I think I'm gonna go through some of this. Ooh, let me see. Okay. Let's see if I can do 12 pages. Okay, I'm gonna have another thing of aqua here. Y'all want me to do some more? You say do some more? Okay. And I want to buy some more in this series. So drop me a piece. Y'all can drop me $1 or $2. We've got thousands and thousands of subscribers. If my 2,800 people drop like $2, man, I could like liquidate my book thing. But anyway, let me go ahead. Come on, y'all. Y'all ready? Let's do some more. This is chapter 3. White masculinity and sexual violence against enslaved black women. Thousands are ushered into the world annually who, like myself, owe their existence to white fathers and most frequently to their masters and their masters' sons. The slave woman is at the mercy of their fathers, sons or brothers of her master. The thoughtful know the rest. That quote is from Frederick Douglass. Hattie, a young enslaved woman in Louisiana, regularly escaped into the woods for several weeks at a time to evade beatings from her mistress and the overseer. Despite Hattie's efforts to please her mistress, she was never content. How y'all liking that feminism? On one particular occasion when Hattie had escaped, Lorenzo, an enslaved woman on a nearby plantation, was hoeing in a field when Hattie called on her over the fence. Hattie was nearly naked when she asked for some food to eat. Hattie explained, Lorenzo had my child in the woods. It is dead, and I buried it in a piece of my frock shirt. Lorenzo heard that Hattie had already had 2 children by her master's son, and he reckoned that one that Hattie had given birth to and the woods was his son too. Although Hattie had wanted to marry a man who was enslaved with her, the master would not let her because he wanted her for his son. Hattie's master had determined that her body and sexuality belonged to his son, resulting in at least 2 children, a traumatic birthing experience. Despite her attempts to hide in the woods, Hattie was eventually found when 6 white men and 10 dogs searched for her. forcing her back to the master's house where she would be put in stocks each night and beaten each morning until she died from punishment. By reserving Hattie for his son, the white master had directly transmitted his expectation from his generation to his son's generation. Not only did the father create an opportunity for his son to engage in sexual violence against the enslaved black woman, but the process he had also taught his son the appropriate ways of performing white masculinity through sexual domination of enslaved black women and a sense of entitlement to this violence. This chapter explores the transmission of white masculinity from one generation of white men to the next through the rape of enslaved black women, as well as the social pressures and familial roles in sexual violence. The rape of enslaved black women allowed white men to accomplish the expectations of white masculinity, including performing sexual domination and losing one's virginity without disrupting white gender norms, like white feminine purity. Since white gender norms are fundamentals of the preservation of white sexism, the oppression of enslaved black women through rape was a tool for simultaneously preserving white sexism, achieving white masculinity, and reinforcing the subordination of enslaved black women. The concurrent construction of these institutions of oppression through the single act of rape reflects the way in which racism and sexism intersect and reinforce one another. For example, for white men, the need to maintain white sexism in order to preserve white male privileges and powers intertwined with their dependence upon racial oppression for their status as whites. Because of the interrelationship between sexism and racism, the rape of enslaved black women sustained both. This chapter will also explore white men's strategies for carrying out sexual violence against enslaved black women, such as courting practices and fetishizing light-skinned black women, which were required to preserve the intersectional hierarchy. Within the intersectional hierarchy, white masculinity is the highest status, and subordinate groups fell into intermediary categories below. Based on their location within the hierarchy, each group experiences its own set of incentives and consequences for behavior, degrees of power and privilege, and or forms of subordination. White masculinity can take many forms, encompassing several dimensions that shift regionally, evolve over time, and vary according to social class. During the antebellum period in the United States, slavery significantly shaped the social norms and dominant form of masculinity for Southern white men. The characteristics admired in white sons were in direct contrast to those traits whites observed among enslaved men and women. Honor, dominance, and independence reflect defining features of white masculinity during this period and were frequently achieved through violence and subordination of enslaved people. It is likely that the rape of enslaved women was particularly common among wealthier white boys and men who had most access to enslaved black women as property. However, some sources from slavery note that white men of all social class backgrounds engaged in this sexual exploitation. Among wealthy white Southerners, to be a white man required being a master of others, encompassing a complex array of behaviors, and which including managing enslaved people and being served by them. These lessons in white masculinity were fostered from an early age. White Southern boys experienced the pleasure to fulfill their roles as independent dominators, with some parents even training their white sons to practice dominance when interacting with enslaved children. But white boys didn't simply become white men through exerting dominance over subordinated others. Sexual norms dictated that white men also progressed into full manhood through sexual intercourse. Freak-offs. Therefore, dominance through sex offered a clear way for achieving several expectations required of white masculinity, including autonomy, control over others, entitlement, and sexual prowess. Social expectations surrounding elite white masculinity thus promoted sexual violence and the exploitation of enslaved black women and other vulnerable women. Sexual norms are particularly important in white masculinity because they sharply differentiate white men from white women and black men, two groups with whom they may have otherwise shared commonalities in racial or masculine identity. An under-researched topic beyond the scope of this book includes the rape of black men by white women and white men during slavery. This sexual violence reflects experiences of black men who are subjugated to extreme forms of oppression historically and today, but who are frequently overlooked in analysis. Although white women could enact relative dominance over enslaved individuals, including sexually violating enslaved black men, and we should mention they raped black women too, social norms around their sexual behavior only rewarded them for remaining sexually inactive, except with their husbands. Moreover, enslaved black men were distinguished from white men in many ways, including prohibitions against interracial sex. Black men's sexual behavior was framed as evidence of hypersexuality, whereas white men's sexual behavior was considered necessary for physical well-being. In this sense, white men were the only group whose status was augmented through sexual dominance over other people. Indeed, many physicians and the general public believe that white men required sexual intercourse to preserve their health and masculinity. This belief lingered into the 1890s despite the norms associated with Christian virtue dictating that white men should practice constraint against sexual desires. In contrast to the biological myth that men required sex to become masculine, white women were expected to remain virgins, sometimes prohibited from behaviors like holding hands, in addition to refraining from sex. By the early 1800s, the notion that white women were passionless became central to defining their sexuality and promoting virginal status of white women. Control over white women's sexuality was an indicator of white men's power over white women, but it also served to reinforce racial statuses. White women's purity could be used as an impossible standard for enslaved black women and Native American women who were vulnerable to rape by white men at the time. Whites have an extensive history of manipulating sexual norms to promote notions of white superiority and black inferiority by associating sexual deviance and primitiveness with both people of color. Despite potential conflict created by the incompatible gender expectations for whites, coerced intercourse with enslaved black women allowed white boys and men to achieve sexual release they believed was essential to their masculinity while simultaneously protecting white women's purity. Associated with this perceived health need of white men, the social expectation to lose one's virginity and engage in sex for recreational purposes encouraged white men's routine sexual violence of enslaved black women. For centuries, the loss of virginity has been viewed as a rite of passage for men. During the antebellum period, sex offered one step for white boys to transition into white manhood. Physicians in the 1800s believed that masturbation, understood to be a symptom of adolescence, could be cured through sexual intercourse. Implied these physicians believed that the value placed on reaching adulthood for white men. To ensure that white boys achieved this important status, some fathers sent their sons to brothels to establish their masculinity. Moreover, sex surveys from the early 1800s found that a sizable minority of men had paid to lose their virginity before marriage. Although in the North, some wealthy young white men would hire prostitutes in order to lose their virginity, in the South, young white men appeared to have hired prostitutes less frequently because of the captive black women at their disposal. Often, enslaved women were the first sexual partner for Southern white males because of the availability of such women and their inability to refuse a young white men's sexual advances. The use of prostitutes and enslaved women to carry out sexual expectations for white men reflect the centrality of not just sex, but more specifically, sexual exploitation and dominance through sex for white masculinity. Sexual violence for the sake of losing one's virginity to achieve white manhood exemplifies the dependency of white masculine identity upon the degradation of racialized, gendered others. Enslaved black women were merely objects to serve the needs of white men, whether that meant laboring in the fields and in the house or through sexual dominance to achieve white masculinity. White men's status depended upon and could be elevated through the degradation of those subordinate to them. Not only white masculinity and racism, but also the institutions of white sexism depended on the sexual degradation of enslaved black women and other subordinate women. White gender norms reinforce the myth of gender binary, wherein women are perceived to be naturally the opposite from and inferior to white men. This gender binary justifies sexism, making the inferiority of women appear part of the natural order rather than a socially constructed in the interest of men. For example, Distinct sexual standards for white women and white men reinforce notions of naturally opposite genders whose sexual needs and preferences diverge based on biological differences. The rape of enslaved black women allowed white men to carry out their perceived sexual needs without disrupting white feminine norms around sexuality, which distinguish white women from white men and from black women, thus preserving the myth of the gender binary, white sexism and racism. Here, white sexism and racial oppression are clearly intertwined and reinforce one another. As important as losing one's virginity was the precursor for fulfilling the standards of white manhood, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women did not stop for sons after the initial act, as reflected in this footnote of a trial pamphleteer from 1845. Quote, "It is no unusual thing at the South to see the son of a slaveholder going to a slave auction for the purpose of buying a beautiful, accomplished female, whom slavery condemns to the shambles of vice, to be appropriated for his sensual gratification. Many of these young men are not more than 16 years old when their parents allow them to begin these hellish practices. Nay, more than this, young men often go into the cotton and rice fields in the open day and commit acts of the most revolting libertinism on helpless girls who are compelled to labor 15 hours a day under the rays of a southern sun." I need to look this up real fast. What's 38? 28. Almost. Notice I said that she ignores. This is from a religious book. This is some abolitionist or Christian type thing. None of this exists. I mean, it's all just frames and struggles inside them. Just understand they'll find a way to not explain what it is because they want to remove God from. There's no such thing. Okay, just want to mention that. White boys purchased enslaved black women specifically to satisfy their sensual desires and regularly sexually violated them as an afternoon activity. In addition to performing white masculinity through the sexual exploitation of enslaved black women, the process of paying large sums of money for a beautiful enslaved black woman was a demonstration of a man's white high-class status. As described in the introduction to this volume, at the public auctions in New Orleans, wealthy white men would compete to outbid each other for attractive women up for sale. This public affair offered an opportunity for white men to perform their wealth and dominance, and they typically paid up to 3 times more than the going rate for enslaved women, purchased for sexual purposes. Purchasing an attractive enslaved woman and engaging in routine sexual violence against them resulted in an ongoing performance of white masculinity, continually reaffirming the social norms of white men long after the goal of losing one's virginity had been accomplished. Robert Smalls, yeah, I've heard of him. Former enslaved man, was interviewed about his observations in South Carolina. He reiterated the common practice of white sons sexually violating enslaved black women. In the course of his interview, he was asked, suppose a son of the master wanted to have intercourse with a colored woman, was he at liberty? To which Smalls responded, quote, "No, not at liberty, because it was considered a stain on the family, but the young men did it. There was a good deal of it. They often kept one girl steady, and sometimes 2 were on different places. Men had wives did it too sometimes. If they could get it on at their own place, it was easier, but they would go wherever they could get it." Close quote. Wonder why they're promoting the slut whore culture, sisters? Notice the absence of resistance from feminists to this slut whore culture that they promoted. Like their fathers, white sons regularly sexually violated enslaved women, whether they were part of their family's property or someone else's. White men had used sexual violence recreationally in a way that helped define them as white men. Although they were not always at liberty to engage in the rape of enslaved black women, white men's ability to do so without consequences distinguished them from all other racial and gender groups. Not only could white men evade the consequences of their actions, but they also benefited from the sexual violence by reinforcing their high status as white men who had the luxury of finding recreation through the violation of other people's bodies. In a letter that a white man named William Ball sent to his brother, he offers insight into the connection between recreation and sexual exploitation of enslaved women for white men. Ball advised his brother Isaac to find enslaved women for sexual purpose, explaining that, quote, he ought now to get to plaything, to amuse you at leisure hour when you're sitting by a fireside on an evening, close quote. Ball's letter implies that sexually exploiting enslaved women for recreation and leisurely purposes is considered an expected and an acceptable part of development for white men, underlying the explicit message to use enslaved women for sexual gratification and amusement. Ball advised his brother to review enslaved women as playthings, thus objectifying them and forcing them into the role of entertainers, while at the same time suggesting that Isaac occupies an entitled role in which he should be served and entertained. Josiah Quincy also commented on the common enjoyment of a Negro or mulatto woman is quite a common thing. No reluctance, delicacy, or shame is made about the matter. It is far from uncommon to see a gentleman at a dinner and his reputed offspring a slave to the master of the table. The recreational sexual violence engaged by white boys and men reflects the privilege they possess that allowed them to enjoy leisure activities at the expense of others, an additional defining characteristic of white masculinity, and particularly of elite white masculinity, a symbol of high class and status. Leisure and recreational activities distinguish white men from those who are subordinate to them in terms of race, class, and gender. And Diddy never playing that game. William Ball's letter to his brother exemplifies the role that family members played in socializing white boys to become white men through sexual violence against enslaved black women. Through the process that will be referred to here as the intergenerational transmission of white masculinity, white boys were informally taught that becoming a white man involved the sexual exploitation of those subordinate to them. During slavery, white boys in the South were encouraged to see themselves as sexually entitled to the bodies of women, particularly enslaved black women, and to view sexual exploitation of these women as important for accomplishing white masculinity. The notion of intergenerational transmission of white masculinity derived from the concept of intergenerational transmission of wealth developed by Joe Fagan, which refers to the process of white parents passing wealth to their children and maintaining an economic advantage over people of color for generations after originally accumulating the wealth from slavery and exploited labor. In addition to wealth, the families pass on expectations of behavior and attitudes of their children as a form of cultural capital which can be exchanged for status and success. This process allows for elements of white masculinity developed during slavery to be passed on through generations in modified forms. The intergenerational transmission of white masculinity occurs through the process of learning and transmitting attitudes, skills, and expectations. Transmitting white masculinity through the generations is essential to the reproduction of oppression, which includes practices of domination as well as attitudes of white racial framing, which justify domination. What distinguishes intergenerational transmission of white masculinity from the mere socialization is the significance of the types of ideas, values, and expectations for behavior that are transmitted from one generation to the next, which is associated with the perpetuation of white masculine privilege and power, and thus are partly responsible for the reproducing a larger system of intersectional oppression. In addition to the accumulation of wealth during slavery, which continues to benefit whites, the passage of expectations of white entitlement to the bodies of others in the form of labor, violence, and or sexual exploitation is passed from slavery to the present day. Teaching white masculinity and the norms that incentivize sexual violence against black women took both direct and indirect forms. For example, some white men were directly taught their sons about acceptance of raping enslaved women while modeling their behavior. Direct teaching is evidence in the experience of Ethel Jane, a teenager at the time. Ethel Jane was enslaved when her master's son raped her. Bird Walton, a formerly enslaved man, himself recounted an event. Master brought his son Levi down to the cabin. They both took her, the father showing the son what it was all about. She couldn't do nothing about it. Thus, Walton describes a way in which the white father directly taught his sons how to rape enslaved women and modeled their acceptance of this behavior. Despite the fact that premarital sex is considered morally wrong by most white men and women in the South, black women present an exception to this standard. Although some mothers were offended by their son or husband's sexual relationships with enslaved women, they tended to stay quiet about their feelings or blame black women for being too promiscuous. Moreover, examples demonstrate that not just fathers but mothers and other relatives would encourage sexual violation of enslaved black women by their white sons. Take, for example, the behavior of Charlie and his mother, according to a footnote in a trial pamphlet from October 1845. Albert Terrell describes the behavior of white sons on plantations and the involvement of their parents in this sexual violence. He explains, quote, one of the noblest families of Virginia purchased 3 attractive mulatto females and placed them in a cottage near the family mansion for the exclusive use of their only son, assigning as a reason why they did it that if it might make Charlie steady. Is there a God in heaven? Close quote. This passage highlights both the role of mothers and fathers in teaching their white sons to use enslaved black women for recreational or status augmenting purposes. This purchase not only transmitted a message from the mother to a son regarding her approval as a white woman of such behavior, but also her view that sexually violating a number of enslaved black women was an appropriate way to serve his needs as a white man. Parents like Charlie's shaped the context in which white boys were incentivized to engage in sexual violence against enslaved black women in order to fulfill the expectation of them based on their identity as young white men of high socioeconomic status. In another example, one family eager for marriage between a young man in his 20s and a younger girl arranged for him to maintain a black mistress until his fiancée reached a marriageable age. This arrangement allowed the white man to fulfill his perceived needs and masculinity without disrupting white gender norms or threatening the white purity of his future wife. These white parents have an incentive in whiteness to encourage their sons to engage in sexual violence against black women in order to prevent the dissolution of white marriageable ties. Many enslaved black women appear to have been purchased solely for sexual purposes, which taught young white men the acceptable way to view black women and sex in their lives as commodities for their exploitation. White men were taught to sexually objectify enslaved black women and to view acceptable sex as something that could be purchased, coerced, forced with no consideration for the desire of the person with whom they were engaging. Perceiving and treating enslaved black women in this way not only normalized but incentivized for the desire to meet parental and social expectations of behaving like a white man. Parental approval and assistance and the sexual exploitation of an enslaved black woman by white sons transmitted the sense of white male entitlement to the bodies of subordinate women from one generation to the next, and framing of enslaved black women as available for sexual exploitation. Although white masculinity could be performed and achieved, at least in part, through the rape of enslaved black women, conflicting dimensions of white masculinity, such as white virtue, required that white men engage in strategies for carrying out sexual violence in ways that would sustain their positive image. Social decorum maintained that white men should uphold their image as respectable members of the community, and particular sons of elite families aspired to be not only men but gentlemen. Practices for preserving the facade of white virtue in spite of the perpetrators of rampant sexual violence ranged from small gestures and gifts to opulent rooms and servants. Several cases from slavery involve white men who offered gifts, jewelry, and special rooms in the house to an enslaved woman with whom they desired to have sex. For example, Davidson, a white man traveling to the South, remarked on his observation in his diary, explained that young and single men of wealth each have a quadroon for his exclusive use. They are furnished with a chamber and a sitting room, and servants, and all the comforts and elegancies of life. White men engaged in behavior similar to courting practices when sexually exploiting many enslaved black women, which can be understood as a way to navigate their conflicting roles and to preserve the myth of their white virtue. In a speech in Brooklyn in the mid-1800s, Lewis Clark wrote, quote, "Oh, how often I've seen poor girls sob and cry when there's been such a going on. Maybe you think because they're slaves, they ain't got no feeling and no shame. A woman being a slave don't stop her from having genteel ideas. That is, according to their way, and as far as they can. They know they must submit to their masters. Beside their masters, maybe dress them up and make them little presents and give them more privileges while their whims last. This bribery likely served the interests of white men in upholding their image as virtuous white gentlemen, and is described by bell hooks as an attempt by masters to transform the relationship into one of prostitution. In this sense, white men perform courtship rituals in order to overshadow their immoral sexual behaviors. The response of women to these gifts and offerings was not all of significance to the men, but rather necessary for preserving the positive images associated with white masculinity. The guise of courting reframed sexual coercion, forcing the power dynamics between white men and enslaved black women into the background and making the sexual encounter appear consensual. Harriet Jacobs highlights the coercion underlying these acts of courtship, signifying the undermining of any sense that gifts and privileges offered in exchange for sex are representative of actual choice for enslaved black women. As that her accounts demonstrate the clearly coercive nature of her master's gestures. Referring to black women in general, she explains, when she is 14 or 15, her owner or his sons or the overseer, perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped and starved into submission to their will. If enslaved women refuse to admit to the courting practices, they are ultimately forced into sex through physical punishment. Courting is merely a tool for exerting power and coercion and coercing women under the mask of gentleman-like behavior. In many cases reported from slavery, masters would force themselves on women regardless of their decision to accept or deny their gifts. This courting practice was not about attracting an enslaved black woman into choosing the white man as a mate, but rather about demonstrating white masculinity through the symbolic acts of chivalry. Madison Jefferson. This is the son of Thomas Jefferson, by the way. A former slave reported about the physical violence brought upon enslaved black women who rejected sexual advances of their white masters, reflecting the extreme limited options black women had in slavery to resist sexual exploitation, even when physical violence like whipping or threats against one's families were chosen in place of sexual violence. Often the women ultimately were raped as well. They got it anyway. An excerpt of Jefferson's account is summarized here. Quote, women who refuse to submit themselves to the brutal desires of their owners are often whipped to subdue their virtuous repugnance, and in most instances, this hellish practice is but too successful. When it fails, the women are frequently sold off to the South. Madison's young master, albeit a member of the Methodist Church, punished a young woman on the estate repeatedly on this account, and at length accomplished his purpose while she was in a state of insensibility from the effects of a felon blow inflicted by the monster. It means he screwed her after busting her over the head. He popped her on the head and he took it. Okay. Whew. By the way, moderators, keep paying attention. If anybody asks something dumb, out you go. I mean, we've got thousands of people. I don't need you. We don't need you. Go away. Sometimes when my master found that I still refused to accept what he called kind offers, he would threaten to sell my child. Perhaps that will humble you, he said. Humble me? Was I not already in the dust? But his threat lacerated my heart. I knew the law gave him the power to fulfill it, for the slaveholders have been cunning enough to enact the child shall follow the condition of the mother, not of the father, thus taking care that the licentiousness shall not interfere with the avarice. We're at almost the most explosive part. We got just, 3 pages more. Y'all still with me? I'm at page 42, y'all. I'm almost out of this chapter. And I'm going to do the rest of this tomorrow. What time is this? Okay, we're going to stay on this. Any free white man's request was backed by law, which granted white men the right to sell enslaved children and family members and take what they wanted from enslaved men and women, whether it was labor, sex, or someone's life. These gestures of courtship allowed white men to present and perhaps believe themselves as gentlemen, while the law ensured these symbolic offerings did nothing to change the rigid power. The rigid power dynamic between masters and slaves. This is the last portion. Raping lighter-skinned enslaved black women. Utilizing courtship practices was not the only strategy white men engaged in to preserve the intersectional hierarchy. During slavery and Jim Crow segregation, lighter-skinned black women were often used as the most intimate forms of violence, and their attractiveness is frequently noted throughout diaries, narratives, newspapers, divorce petitions, and other documents from slavery. Preference for lighter-skinned enslaved women ensured that white men, through their sexual exploits, would not upset the intersectional hierarchy in which whiteness was viewed as superior. White men's preference for lighter skins reaffirmed the white racial framing, which construction had begun as early as the 1600s, in which fairer skin was viewed by whites as more attractive. John Ferdinand Dalziel Smith, an Englishman visiting America during the early 1700s, discusses the beauty of mixed-race women in his memoir. Traveling through Maryland, Smith noticed that female slaves were now becoming white by their mixture. There are at this time numbers of beautiful girls, many of them fair as any living, who are absolute slaves in every sense. Smith cleverly associates whiteness or fair skin with beauty as if they were synonymous. Moreover, he notes the oddity of slavery coinciding with whiteness and beauty. Mixed-race women are often referred to as bright mulattoes in original documents from slavery, and their attractiveness is commonly noted. Noteworthy attractiveness, light-skinned women were offered white men, an additional justification for sex and rape. Physical and sexual attractiveness of exotic light-skinned women could be considered too powerful to resist, providing an excuse for rape and sexual coercion of enslaved black women. Williams described the use of a similar tactic carried out by men in the modern era who attempt to neutralize or justify the rape of black women by claiming the victim was irresistible and thus the rape was inevitable. Such justification served to excuse sexual violence and adultery for white men, placing the blame on their victims. In his diary, James Davidson shared his impression of light-skinned, mixed-race enslaved women who are frequently known and sold for sexual purposes. Officially, white men claimed that they had purchased these women for domestic services. However, the white men in attendance at slave auctions generally understood the sexual motives behind the procurement. Davidson refers to his observations traveling through Louisiana. Quote, I had often heard of the beauty of quadroons. I found them pretty. They are virtuous and amiable-looking people. They have the appearance of being virtuous, but they're generally prostitutes and camp mistresses. It generally costs from $1,500 to $2,000 a year to keep a quadroon. I am informed that the quadroon is faithful to a proverb in these attachments. Married men in the city are frequently in the habit of keeping quadroon. Davidson describes wealthy white men as keeping mixed-race enslaved women. The concept of keeping significantly softens the reality of the sexual abuse and exploitation but also emphasized the woman's position as a possession of the man. In addition to the telling language David used, Davidson describes the attractiveness of mixed race women sold to be used as sexual slaves, noting that they appear virtuous, but they are generally prostitutes and kept mistresses. He believes that the light skin of the woman could almost fool someone into believing them white or virtuous women. However, the reality of their black ancestry pegs them as prostitutes. Despite the fact that these women are turned into prostitutes by the white men who sell them to other white men for sexual exploitation, they are labeled as prostitutes, as if they were choosing to carry out this practice in an attempt to legitimate the severe sexual exploitation executed upon them. Several aspects of Smith and Davidson's remarks reflect the incentives for white men to engage in sexual violence. The exploitation of lighter skinned black women was a topic for the preserving of the intersectional hierarchy. A preference for light skin tones upheld the perception of whiteness as consistently superior, including in terms of attractiveness. White men could claim that lighter skinned black women were the most desirable black women because they resembled whites. Moreover, light skinned women could be fetishized as exotic. Their rare beauty offered an excuse for white men's sexual appetites and subsequent sexual violence. By preferring light-skinned black women, white men did not need to disrupt their white racial framing of blacks in order to continue their routine sexual violence against enslaved black women. Additionally, the intersectional tactic of framing black women as prostitutes served as a justification for white men's behavior. Fancy-made markets in which light-skinned enslaved black women were sold into prostitution were particularly common in New Orleans. Although white men were the perpetrators of the sexual exploitation, incentivized by the desire to achieve sexual satisfaction and to improve their status as wealthy white men, the consequences of this sexual violence are displaced from white men onto black women through the white racial and gendered framing of them as prostitutes. Whereas the consequences of such behavior could have been negative framing of white men as unvirtuous, by the transferring the negative framing to black women, white men could evade responsibility and the degradation of their own status. The consequences of this framing caused enslaved black women to be further degraded by the negative stereotyping of them as prostitutes, in addition to the sexual abuses they were forced to experience. In addition, labeling enslaved black women as prostitutes allowed white men to frame their sexual encounters as mutual, claiming that women involved were engaging consensually. In contrast, white men were actually purchasing women who were originally forced into slavery in order to use them sexually or by raping or coercing them. White gender norms, familial encouragement to rape, legal backing created the context which enabled and incentivized white boys and white men to engage in sexual violence against enslaved black women. White men could perform sexual masculinity by raping enslaved black women, thereby demonstrating their dominance and sexual prowess. Additionally, losing their virginity and taking advantage of recreational sexual violence allowed white men to perform their racialized masculinity. During slavery, white gender norms were upheld and transmitted intergenerationally through parents' direct teachings and purchasing of enslaved black women for their sons' sexual purposes. Despite a paradoxical double standard on white gender norms regarding sexual promiscuity and premarital sex, the sexual violence against enslaved black women and lower-class white women as prostitutes enabled white gender norms to persist. Because white gender norms are essential for maintaining white sexism, sexual violence by white men against enslaved black women can be understood as an outlet for bolstering white sexism. At the same time, white sexism encouraged white men to engage in sexual violence against enslaved black women by promoting the desire to preserve white female purity while losing one's virginity as a white man. The institution of racial, gender, and class oppression work intricately together. Occasionally, they avoid disrupting one another and instead strengthen each other to ultimately serve the interests of whites and preserving racism and racialized sexism, and white men preserving white sexism. Sexual violence and strategies used to carry out this violence were transmitted from parents to children intergenerationally. Because sexual norms surrounding white masculinity and a belief in the need to lose one's virginity during early adulthood, white boys were often encouraged by their parents, peers, or siblings to sexually violate enslaved black women. The intergenerational transmission of white masculinity was an important mechanism for maintaining cultural and formal institutions of white privilege and power during slavery. This process includes the transfer of norms, attitudes, and adoption of the white racial frame, which promotes the entitlement of white boys and men to the bodies of those subordinate to them, as well as modeling physical acts of sexual violence and rape, embodying the identity of a white man, the most privileged and powerful identity in the U.S. society, acted as a central intersectional incentive for sexual violence. Thus, status and identity could be attained in part through the process of sexually violating enslaved black women. For many white boys in the South, the social esteem as well as the potential economic and political privileges and resources that were associated with being and identified and perceived as a white man created a significant incentive to engage in sexual violence against black women. Ooh, this is a good chapter. This one isn't even that long. Let me see. Y'all want me to read a little bit more? What time is it? I'll read until 1 o'clock. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop about 1:10. Y'all want me to do 20 more minutes? Y'all want me to do some more? Y'all want some more? This chapter here, white women's role in sexual violence against enslaved black women. And y'all know how I hate feminism. I like this chapter. Y'all want me to read this? Who wants to hear this? Hold on, I'll take this down. And I enjoy this. I have not. Hold on. This person said yes. Okay. Let me see if I can get through this. This isn't that long. And let's see. Oh, this is wild. Your allies, are you black women running with these white? Our sisters, my white sisters. Okay. I dedicate this chapter to all the no good pork chop feminists out there. Chapter 4, White Women's Role and Sexual Violence Against Enslaved Black Women. Quote, her back bore the scar of thousands of stripes, not because she was backward in her work, nor because she was unmindful and rebellious spirit, but because she had fallen to her lot to be a slave of a licentious master and a jealous mistress. She shrank before the lustful eye of one and was in danger even of her life at the hands of the other. Between the two, she was indeed accursed. Close quote. This is from Solomon Northrop, 12 Years a Slave. Patsy had a pleasant spirit. From an early age, people would comment on her likability and laughter. Growing up on an enslaved plantation in Louisiana, she was obedient to her master and was known for her ability to pick hundreds of pounds of cotton per day. Miss Epps, the mistress of the household, favored Patsy as a child, playing with her on the veranda and reportedly giving her a biscuit and milk on occasion. All of this changed when Patsy grew older. Her laughter and joyous spirit disappeared when her master, Edwin Epps, began raping her. He whipped Patsy when she refused his sexual advances and unremittingly succeeded in his forceful rape. To exacerbate the situation, Miss Epps responded to this sexual violence with jealousy. Hater. with jealousy. With growing anger and violence towards Patsy, she kept a watchful eye on her and would often physically punish Patsy, throwing bottles or wood in her face. To appease his wife, Master Epps eventually began beating Patsy even when he was not attempting to rape her. Moreover, this did not curb his wife's anger. Her jealousy became so extreme that Mrs. Epps bribed Solomon Northrop, another enslaved man on the plantation, to kill Patsy and hide her body in the swamp. Solomon refused to comply with Miss Epps' wishes. As an enslaved black woman, Patsy found herself at the bottom of the intersectional hierarchy. Her white master was located at the top of the hierarchy, a position from which he was able to sexually exploit Patsy, punish her for resisting him, and in the process provoke jealousy of his wife without experiencing any consequences for himself. Mrs. Epps, married to the master, occupied an intermediate position of both power and submission within this arrangement. She may have had the power to even punish Mr. Epps as a married woman and therefore second-class citizen. However, she did hold limited power as a white woman and free. The status afforded her the power to punish Patsy for being raped by her husband through the use of physical abuse. Patsy, on the other hand, experienced a lack of power and status and bore the brunt of the consequences from Mr. Epps' behavior. Not only did she have minimal power to resist his sexual desires or recourse to legal options as an enslaved woman, but she was also subjected to the surveillance and abuse from Mrs. Epps. Patsy could not escape the violence she continuously experienced at the hands of her master and mistress. When she resisted the sexual violence, she was whipped in a coercive effort by her master. When she submitted to the rape, Patsy was abused by Mrs. Epps, who held her responsible for her own victimization. The intersection of gender and racial oppression created an impossible situation for Patsy. The white man's sexually forceful behavior and lustfulness became Patsy's problem rather than a reflection of his immoral character. Since the white mistress was dependent on her husband for public approval, her emotional devastation and potential humiliation were blamed on Patsy. Rather than feeling powerless and disgraced, Miss Epps was able to exert power over Patsy through physical abuse, thereby reinforcing her superior status as white and free. Clearly, the white mistress directed her negative attention towards Patsy as opposed to her husband, reinforcing her own subordinate status to him and his ability to evade responsibility. The same way white women will blame black men for DEI and affirmative action being taken away, even though they got most of it. And that's what they do. Mrs. Epps' reaction to her husband's sexual behavior was far from an anomaly. Many white women reacted with physical force towards the victims of their husband's sexual violence. However, this was not the only threatening response evoked by these women. Reports in the Works Progress Administration, I'll put a different pair on. Slave narratives, autobiographies, and diaries written by a number of witnesses to slavery describe a variety of ways in which white women reacted to the rape of enslaved women. Each written for their own purpose, these documents construct a picture of the role of white women in relation to their husband's sexual coercion of enslaved black women. Together they reveal white women's most common reaction to rape: to ignore and deny the rape, physically and verbally abuse the victim, or to sell the victim and the resulting children in an attempt to eliminate evidence of the rape. Ignoring sexual violence of enslaved black women. Quote, "In them times, white men went with colored girls and women bold. Anytime they saw one and wanted her, she had to go with him. His wife didn't say nothing about it. These things are going on now, ain't new. They've been happening. That's why I say to you, just leave them alone, because they ain't going to do what they want. They're going to do what they want anyhow." This is an anonymous interview. Close quote. The unnamed participation in this quotation reflects a common practice of white men selecting women of color they desire, forcing them to go with them, while even the free white women are unable to dispute the behavior. In addition to physical and verbal abuse, one of the most common ways in which white women responded to their husband's rape of enslaved black women was to ignore it. These instances in which white women ignored their husband's actions or remained silent with regard to the behavior must be interpreted from an intersectional perspective, which views white women in an intermediate status. Constrained by sexism, white women had limited options for influencing their husband's behavior or resisting their decisions. Between the lack of legal ramifications for the rape, enslaved black women, as well as the legal right of white men to abuse their wives, white women were restricted in their ability to address the sexual violence they witnessed. At the same time, white women had the privilege to overlook and ignore the sexual abuses of their husband inflicted on enslaved black women because of their status as white, which provided a degree of distance from the victims and their husbands' actions. All these factors created a context which incentivized white women to ignore or remain silent about their husband's sexual attacks on black women. Y'all got some great allies, suckers. Harriet Jacobs described incentives for white women to remain silent in her autobiography, detailing her experiences as an enslaved woman. And telling her story, she often recounts her interaction with white women, both the jealousy and the abuse as well as the silence of white women. Based on her own experiences, she explains, quote, "My master, to my knowledge, the father of 11 slaves, but did the mothers dare tell who was the father of their children? Did the other slaves dare allude to it except whispers amongst themselves? No, indeed. They knew too well the terrible consequences. Southern women often marry a man knowing that he is the father of many little slaves. They do not trouble themselves about it. They regard such children as property, as marketable as pigs on the plantation, and it is seldom that they do not make them aware of this, passing them into the slave traders' hands as soon as possible, getting them out of sight." Close quotes. The economic incentive for white women to ignore their husband's rape of enslaved women is evident in Jacob's story. Not only did they sell their husband's offspring in order to avoid the pain and humiliation, they did so for financial gain. Let me just stop and say that 45% of the slaveholders in America were white women. This is something that this broad isn't saying. You have all the power when the slave is yours. So don't let these women don't let this bitch lie to you. These white women own these people. They own basically 50% of the slaves. Don't put all of this on white men. Slavery and racism is a white mom and pop operation. That's why I don't like feminism. I hate it. And I don't respect any black woman that calls herself a feminist, nor any black man. You guys are pussy mouth bitch bastards if you're a man, and you're stupid pork chop feminist stud if you're a woman. We need black women's empowerment for black people. White feminism is the white woman's white supremacist movement that uses stupid ass black women. The same way dumbass black men that get up behind Zionists or white conservatism, little butthurt, buttfuck, weak ass black men that get that. It's the same shit. You need your own damn game, black people. It's stupid to think that someone that doesn't like you is going to share wealth or power. That doesn't happen. There's never enough for two, especially when you're dealing with a racist. So let me just stop that. This lady should not be honest. This is why people like me, and I would have torn this bitch apart. She did a whole lot of research, some stuff I don't know, but I can like tear this shit. This is why they don't have people like Sister Miriam. They don't want us at the universe. They're trying to do all this stuff now, silence all of this, but it's going to come out one damn way or the other. Okay? That's why we have stuff like this. I miss doing this. I'm glad I'm doing it. I'm going to finish this chapter. Okay, let me go back. The financial and emotional incentives for white women to remain silent with regard to the sexual violence of their husbands allowed white men to continue their sexual assaults on enslaved women with minimal resistance. White women raped black women, black children, and black men. Sure, they did. This book is only keep saying white men, white men. No, no, no. They did this together. Together. It's just that simple. Tell the truth on this. Racism it's a partnership. They allowed their husbands to continue their sexual assaults on the slave women with minimal resistance. Furthermore, Jacob suggested that there were severe consequences for enslaved men and women that acknowledged publicly, discussed the sexual behavior of white men. Physical punishment, yet more sexual violence, and separation of families were all mechanisms for ensuring that white men could continue their sexual coercion and rape of enslaved black women without the fear of confrontation from enslaved women and men or their own wives. Denial and silence among white women were central themes in Mary Chestnut's observations of slavery. Chestnut was a wealthy and relatively powerful white woman, diarist in South Carolina. She was born in 1823 to a politically involved family. She married James Chestnut Jr. in 1840. He became a man of considerable power, evidenced by his election to the Senate 18 years later. His status was reaffirmed during the Civil War, in which he was active in secession efforts and eventually became a general. As her comments reflect, Mary Chestnut moved among very elite white men and women, but she also was aware of the experiences and cruelty of slavery. Mary depicts white women's denial or decision to overlook their husbands thus, quote, "Men and women are punished when their masters and mistresses are brutes, and not when they do wrong. And then we live surrounded by prostitute. God forgive us, but ours is a monstrous system of wrong and iniquity. This only I see, like the patriarchs of old, our men all live in one house with their wives and their concubines and their mulattoes. One sees in every family exactly resemble white children. Every lady tells you who the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household, but those in her own, she seems to think dropped from the clouds or pretends to think, close quote." Sister Miriam, anybody that says anything stupid, it's a 24-hour timeout. If I catch someone, I just kick them out. Chestnut's description of white women pointing the finger of blame at other families while overlooking their husbands' actions speaks to the importance of upholding an appropriate image of one's self and family within the community. The negative opinion of others could be dismissed by denying the adultery, the sexual violence by their husbands against enslaved women, the incentive to represent oneself as achieving the standards of upper-class whiteness, including the moral ideas of sexual loyalty within marriage, provoke white women's denial of their husband's sexual behavior. In the process of saving face as a married woman, their denial assisted white men to continue their sexual exploits. Effectively, white women's silence exacerbated the consequences for enslaved black women who continued to be sexually victimized without protection from white women who, under other social, legal, legal and political circumstances, might have been among the few to resist their husband's behavior. White men held overarching power, thus encouraging those subordinate to them that may have disapproved of their actions to remain silent. They act like all these women oppose this stuff. They didn't. Some of these people were getting rich. They didn't care. An unnamed interviewee for the Works Progress Administration, Slave Narratives, alludes to the harsh realities of slavery, giving the account of the inability of a white mistress of the household to protest her husband's sexual actions towards one of the young enslaved girls. She explains, quote, "Now sometimes if you was a real pretty young girl, somebody would buy you without knowing anything about you just for yourself. Before my old master died, he had a pretty girl he was going with, and he wouldn't let her work nowhere but in the house. And his wife, nobody else, didn't say nothing about it. They know better. She had 3 children for him, and when he died, his brother come and got the girl and the children. Silencing white women created an open path for white men to inflict their sexual desires on enslaved women. This silence, produced by fear, signaled the explanation that wives would refrain from saying anything because they know better. The fear was due to at least the distinct power dynamic between white men and white women's dependency on white men for financial security. Legally, white men had the power to treat their wives as they pleased, creating an incentive for white women to remain silent. Physical force and abuse against white women was legal during slavery, and this limited the power of white women. During the 1800s, a variety of state courts declared that the man had a right to execute moderate chastisement of his wife in cases of emergency. As was recorded in the Mississippi Supreme Court, 1824 Bradley v. State, and 1874 the Supreme Court of North Carolina determined, although a husband should not have the right to chastise his wife, if no permanent injury had been inflicted, no malice or cruelty, dangerous violence shown by the husband, it's better to draw the curtain and shut out the public gaze and leave the parties to forgive or forget. Maryland declared wife beating a crime for the first time in the United States in 1882. However, in many cases, the men were not punished for this crime. For example, in 1962, domestic violence cases were transferred from family courts instead of criminal courts to New York, thereby ensuring that men would receive much less severe punishment for crimes against their wives. In addition to physical violence, marital rape was held as an exemption to the rape law until the 1970s, where states began criminalizing the behavior. Because white women had little legal recourse for physical punishment or rape from their husbands, upon whom they were financially dependent, they had a strong incentive to oblige their husbands and approve of their behavior and remain silent when they felt it was necessary to do so. The following incident found in the divorce petition describes the kind of threats and punishments associated with white women's attempt to stop their husband's sexual exploitation of black women. Martha Evans, a white woman from North Carolina, involved in the case, was in all probability less interested in protecting black women from her husband's sexual assaults than protecting her own interests and protecting her husband from committing adultery. Nevertheless, she did thwart his attempts. In 1834, Martha Evans divorced David Evans on the ground of adultery and several assaults. One notable incident she relayed in the courts occurred in 1832. Martha found David in the act of attempting to gratify his criminal desires on a Negro woman using physical force. She tried to intervene to stop him. However, David grabbed Martha and inflicted on her such a beating that she was nearly helpless for a week. He told Martha the next morning that he wished he had killed her. The legal system bolstered the constant threat of physical force and abuse for women like Martha Evans, who had minimal legal protection for defending themselves from such violence other than through divorce. As a reflection of the institutionalized white sexism, laws upholding men's rights to abuse their wives ensured that many white women remained silent about their husbands' sexual violence against enslaved black women. White sexism worked in two ways to silence white women. First, white women's subordinate status to white men ensured their silence due to economic dependence and lack of political and legal rights in relation to their husbands. In the United States, this economic dependence stemmed from many factors, including the division of the paid productive labor, which belonged largely to free white men and single white women, and unpaid reproductive labor, or the birthing and raising of children for which married white women and enslaved black women were responsible. In the early 1800s, when manufacturing jobs were moved outside the domestic sphere, married white women left home without the ability to earn money. Moreover, for married white women's legal autonomy rested with their husbands, meaning that these women were unable to own property or manage their own wages. The threats made by white men to their wives and the implicit consequences associated with resisting a white man's decision reduced the potential for resistance among white women. The legal suppression of a white woman's rights allowed white men to to control the types of behavior they could engage in on the account of physical or economic threats or abuse. Second, because sexism is racialized, white women and black women did not experience sexism in the same way, creating significant hierarchical divides between these groups of women. These divides occurred in part because it was difficult to identify with one another's experiences with sexism when their differences were based on race. For example, during slavery, white women were subjected to the stereotypes and standards of sexual purity, which acted as an important source of control over their behavior. In contrast, black women were stereotyped as hypersexual in order to rationalize the rape and the breeding that was frequently carried out against them. The hierarchical divisions encouraged a conflict between the groups of women due to the failure to recognize the role of white men in each group's subordination. White women higher up in the hierarchy found incentives to reinforce the subordination of those beneath them, such as blaming enslaved black women for their sexual victimization in order to feel empowered. Few examples exist in which white women like Martha Evans attempted to intervene against the sexual violence of their husbands. Even if white women had the legal protection to resist their husbands' actions, their racial, class, and free status detached them from the experiences of enslaved black women and created incentives for subordinating them. White women could feel superior despite their inferior status as women when treating enslaved black women as more inferior than themselves. Instead of recognizing the ultimate power of white men and reacting in ways to punish white men to achieve their own power, white women concentrated their efforts on blaming enslaved black women for their sexual victimization. Conflict focused on this direction merely reinforced racial oppression while doing nothing to mitigate white sexism. Together, these dimensions and the associated behaviors of white women worked to the disadvantage of white women and to the detriment of enslaved black women, thus exemplifying the way that institutions of sexism and racism mutually construct one another. White sexism and systematic racism intersected to encourage both a lack of resistance against white men and, in cases of slavery, the continued rape of enslaved black women and the abuse of these women by white women who blamed them for being raped. White women reacted to their husbands' sexual coercion of enslaved black women with physical and verbal abuse of the women. Peter Still's narrative exposes the abuse that followed such sexual victimization. At 13, Maria was petite for her age, light-skinned, and uncommonly pretty. After working in the house one morning, the mistress could not find Maria. She began searching various rooms of the house before discovering Maria in the parlor with the master, who immediately mounted his horse and rode off to escape the storm. Though well he knew the full fury would fall upon the young head of his victim. Indeed, the mistress beat Maria until she was tired but not satisfied, and eventually locked her in a brick smokehouse for 2 weeks, released her only to whip her more. Maria's mother, Jenny, would sneak her bread and water throughout those weeks so that she could survive. Other enslaved men and women begged the mistress to let Maria out, explaining she would die under such conditions that the master was to blame. She was only a child. However, the mistress replied she would just as soon have her die. The mistress had no shame in her behavior. Her decision to recount the details of his story to all the enslaved people that she and her husband owned, as well to anyone who stopped by the house, likely served as a demonstration of her authority, as well as a potential threat to other enslaved men and women. When her oldest son Charles visited, she explained the situation to him and asked him to sell Maria to the harshest master he could find. As a young teenager, Maria not only experienced sexual violence from her master, but the extreme physical abuse from the mistress. The white man literally fled the situation, symbolic of his power to evade responsibility, while leaving those subordinate to him to engage in the conflict he had created. The white man who had the power to rape Maria, therein creating tension between his wife and the young enslaved woman, also had the ability to leave and avoid all the consequences of his action. His absence created a space in which only Maria remained a target for his wife's anger and punishment. In this context, white and black women were pitted against each other. No, white women were for the white cause. They're not pitted against each other because of the white man's action. See, she's some feminist. She's probably not with the man. No, you're on one team. There's nothing wrong with that. Be who you are. Don't try to act like white women are a separate group from white men. That's dishonest. Sexual violence enacted by a white man against an enslaved black woman reinforced racial divisions between white women and black women by creating jealousy and conflict. The black women weren't jealous. The black women weren't conflicted. This conflict made it difficult for white women to see the shared interests they held with black women and eliminating the power of white men to rape. Crap. Instead, situations like Maria's offered white women an opportunity to demonstrate power over enslaved women through the use of physical force and status, ameliorating their resentment and humiliation in the process because white women and enslaved black women were put in conflict with each other. They weren't put in conflict. Why didn't you blame your husband? Why didn't you ignore it? You ignored the stuff that was going on. Be very careful, feminists. Feminists are liars, all of them. I've never met an honest one, ever. And I don't think I ever will. So black woman pitted. What's this girl going to do? You find her raped and you try to kill her? I mean, she's not conflicting. All she can do is get hurt. Conflict. She's rationalizing white women doing exactly what they did. They were getting their MFM. And they were getting on their racial hatred. Yes, they were. Because white women and enslaved black women put in conflict with each other, efforts to resist white men. What do you mean white men? Were diverted, thus reinforcing sexism and racism. Richard Max witnessed a similar shift of the blame when the white man responsible for raping the enslaved girl onto the victim herself. Enslaved in Maryland, Max explained that a doctor in his neighborhood bought a girl and installed her on the place for his own use. When the wife discovered this arrangement, she severely beat the young girl. As was the case in many instances, the married white woman directed her punishment at the enslaved girl who had been purchased for sexual purposes rather than her husband, who had the choice, resources, and legal rights to carry out the sexual behavior. Harriet Jacobs experienced the same jealousy at the first hand while enslaved in Edenton, North Carolina. She describes the sexual threat posed by her master, Dr. Norcom. She recognized the potential for white women to take an alternative role than that of the jealous housewife, describing the mistress as one who ought to protect the helpless victim, but who has no other feelings towards her but those of jealousy and rage. At a young age, children learn through violent outbreaks of jealous passion the reason the mistress hates certain enslaved women. Between fear of the master and jealousy of the mistress, the enslaved woman found herself additionally restrained within the confines of slavery. The sexual jealousy of the mistress were exacerbated by the perceived attractiveness of the enslaved woman. Jacob explains, if God has bestowed beauty upon her, it will prove her greatest curse. That which commands admiration of a white woman only hastens the degradation of a female slave. While physical attractiveness may have increased the status of a white woman, for a black woman it was associated with the degraded eroticization which threatened white women. Attractiveness was used as an excuse for fetishizing, thus sexually violating black women. Rather than adding status or power, their beauty made them primary targets for rape and jealousy. Let me stop here. This is why the feminists and all of them put ugly, fat, unappealing black women up as representing black women. And it seems as if these stupid-ass black feminists are clueless. You're the ugliest thing of all times, and you need to be the center of attention. They don't do that with ugly white women. Ugly white women know their place. Ugly black women put up by white studs, they think they made it. It's disgusting. Feminism is trash. Jealousy could be as dangerous as any threat for an enslaved woman. In Jacob's case, Dr. Flint did not allow others to punish her, including his wife. Despite this, on turning 16, Jacobs felt as though her presence was intolerable to Mrs. Flint. Mrs. Flint was never satisfied, but in her angry moods, no terms were too vile to bestow upon me. In spite of this ill treatment, Jacobs felt pity towards Miss Flint, explaining, I never wronged her or wished to wrong her. One word of kindness from her would have brought me to her feet. Her reflections on Miss Flint allude to the potential for enslaved black women and white women to come together. Keep on dreaming. As opposed to succumbing to the divisions created by white masters in the household. I need to just stop and tell you, I'm going to pull it up and read about the Bronx slave markets. You guys don't know, but the same way you see the Hispanics, these Latino men outside Home Depot, black women used to hang out there and hope that white women would hire them. And the white women treated the black women like shit. They would often beat, cheat, abuse, lie to, and then accuse the black woman of stealing and get their ass a case. If the woman didn't clean their house and they didn't want to pay them, just call the cops on them. There was no white man involved. There was no sex. I'm white. I got power over you. Like these Karens that run up to people with their phones. No white man made them do anything. Nobody's sleeping with their man. They hate. Stop trying to change this. This whole has an agenda. And you know I'm not going to go for this. I know I'm not going to go for this. I'm almost done. You know what? I feel like stopping because this book isn't that long. I'm going to finish. I'm going to stop. I'm going to read a little bit more. Hold on. I'm going to read a little bit more. But she's tripping. Okay. They could come together as opposed to succumbing to the divisions created by white masters of the household. White women that didn't own slaves were racist like this. So don't. These people lie, okay? Jacobs recognized Dr. Flint's responsibility in disrupting the relationship between herself and Mrs. Flint. Based on the account available, Mrs. Flint did not seem to acknowledge Dr. Flint's role in creating the conflict between her and Jacobs, and she did not express sympathy for Jacobs despite the abuses regularly inflicted upon her and her lack of options avoiding Dr. Flint's sexual attempts. Instead, the most disrespected and abused subject in this situation, Jacobs was the one able to see the actual cause of the conflict in a way Mrs. Flint, she said, could not. No, would not. She knew her husband was no damn good. Women aren't that damn stupid. You know when your man's not shit. You know when your man's a hoe. You know when your man is got a loose zipper. You don't need some racial experience to do that. This is the kind of bullshit that feminists pull. See, she's good at telling the white man, the white man, the white man. That sounds just like these Negroes that blame white people for stuff that coons do. Be very careful of someone that's constantly saying white man, white man, white man, white man. No, it's systems. It's people. It's groups. It's institutions. White men can't do this. White men need white women. White men need coons and the boule for us to be where we are. Let me keep going. Mrs. Flint was blinded by racialized sexism and her incentive to maintain the institution of whiteness. Mrs. Flint could only rely on stereotypes of black women as inferior and hypersexual to blame Jacobs for her misfortune. How's she going to tell how this woman was thinking? How the hell did she know? When the black woman's running from the white man, what's hypersexual about that? When he owns you, where can she go to not be hypersexual? You're mad with your lot as being a superior white woman that includes him topping off sexually the other women on the plantation that are black. That's the price of the ticket, racist feminist bitch. It ain't something special or hypersexual. Look at you know, try to make these women victims. These folks aren't victims, they're beneficiaries of the same racism she's talking about to make it seem as if white women to get nothing out of it. Bullshit. I've got a book, They Were Her Property. I need to read some of that. Flint could rely on stereotypes of black women as inferior and hypersexual to blame Jacobs for her misfortune, or depend on social norms tolerating white men's entitlement to sexually violate women. Additional incentives to appease her white husband, who had the power over her resources which she could often utilize, likely encouraged her to shift responsibility from her husband onto Jacobs. Mrs. Flint was unable to sympathize with Jacobs, nor recognize shared oppressor. He's not your oppressor. He's your husband. When he dies, you get all the property. Your business partners. A marriage is a business contract. It's a damn lie. You're acting like you don't got nothing in common with the man you're making kids with. Bullshit. My ancestor, my grandfather, had a white wife and he had black concubines. He owned the black children as slaves. That white woman was living good as hell. And she was a younger white bitch that got with a white dude who got rich breeding black people. Okay? One of them's my grandfather. I don't want to hear this. Let me keep reading. Mrs. Flint was unable to sympathize or recognize his shared oppressor due to her desire to benefit from whiteness. What else is she going to benefit from? The people came here to benefit from whiteness. Are they going to reject it? You came over here to be better than the Indians and the other people. You're not going to use the tool? Nobody gives up power. What's this whole talking about? And she's Jewish. Are they going to give up power to the people in Gaza and the West Bank? Well, let me get off of that because I'm going to get my channel taken. By adhering and upholding the negative framing of black women and the positive framing of white men, Jacob's ability to sympathize with Flint is linked to her location within the intersectional hierarchy, whereas Miss Flint had incentives to ignore. Incentives, that's it. You got paid to be like you were. Incentives to ignore the experiences of black women. Jacob's location did not offer the same incentives. Instead, because Jacob's status offered limited reasons to adhere to white racial framing of blacks or whites, she was able to see the role each person with less bias, acknowledging the interplay between white men, white women, and black women. Come on. Come on. Although Jacobs does not describe physical harm, she was deeply scarred by the sexual harassment of Dr. Flint and the verbal abuse from Mrs. Flint. In addition to directing blame to enslaved black women who were sexually harassed and victimized, white women would use their power to punish black women, their white husbands, by murdering. Listen to this. They're so powerless. So she has no agency. By murdering the offspring that resulted from the sexual violence. An unnamed interviewee who was enslaved in Georgia described one incident where a white woman took severe action against her husband, a woman involved in murdering their offspring. One white lady that lived near us in McBean slipped in a colored girl's room and cut the baby's head clean off because it belonged to her husband. He beat her about it and started to kill her, but she begged, so I reckon he got to feeling sorry for her, but he kept on going with the colored girl, and they had more children. The white woman beheaded the black baby. They don't have no power, no agency. White men pitted her. What did the baby damn do? It's the same people that want you to kill your babies, silly ass black women. Dumbass, gullible black women not thinking. You don't got no friends but God, your sisters, and your brothers. In this case, the white woman reacted strongly and cruelly. This happened a lot. A lot of stuff isn't written down because it's all been covered up. It's been hidden to protect the guilty. Same way they shred shit in corporations. You don't have the right to know because America is basically a crime scene. The whole nation. There's not enough yellow tape for this country. In this case, a white woman reacted strongly and cruelly. Strongly? Cruelly? Unable to influence her husband's behavior or punish him physically without retaliation or legal recourse, the woman was able to murder a child born into slavery. She likely saw this as an opportunity that would result in minimal legal repercussions due to the slave status of the child. She knew she was white. She could kill and destroy black folks. What all this powerless and intersectional bullshit? Despite her power to carry out this murder as free white, her actions were met with severe physical punishment from the husband who threatened to kill her. But he didn't. The black baby's gone. The murder of children by white women, such as in this example, arises occasionally in narratives and diaries of enslaved people. A similar incident is described by a man named Moses Roper. Roper, born in Caswell County, North Carolina, was a formerly enslaved man. In his narrative, he describes a violent story of his arrival into the world. When Moses was born, the white mistress, Miss Roper, sent one of her slaves to check whether he had been born white or black. The enslaved woman reported that he was white and resembled Mr. Roper very much. Mrs. Roper got a large club, stick, and knife and went into my mother's room with the full intention to murder me with the knife and club. Luckily, Mrs. Roper's mother walked in and stopped the knife, saving his life. As was often the case, when a white man's sexual violence against enslaved women resulted in children, Moses and his mother were sold soon after. What do you mean they didn't have any power? Why didn't you get them sold? She's covering up here, guys. Let me see, it's 110. I'm going to go a little bit longer. Selling enslaved black women and their children or convincing one's husband to sell them resulted in separating families in order to conceal the sexual behavior and the humiliation experienced by the white woman of the household. As previously noted, Harriet Jacobs witnessed white women selling enslaved children of their husbands as a way of making a profit as well. Frederick Douglass, a writer and abolitionist, described the pattern of white masters selling their enslaved offspring, splitting up families in order to appease their white wives. Referring to children, he explains, quote, "What is still worse, perhaps such a child is a constant offense to the wife. She hates its very presence." This is white hate, too. Just because it's female hate doesn't mean it ain't racist. And when a slave-holding woman hates, so let's try, when a white slave-holding woman hates, she wants not means white women. White women, I mean, are idols at the South, not wives, for the slave women are preferred in many instances, and if these idols but nod or lift a finger, woe to these poor victims. Kicks, cuffs, and stripes are sure to follow. That means they're going to get shackled, they're going to get kicked and beaten. Masters are frequently compelled to sell this class of their slaves out of deference to the feelings of their white wives. This bitch contradicted. So white women get upset. He'll beat, kill, sell off. It's a lie that white women have no power in a relationship. A lot of men want their women happy. A lot of men do what they can to hide from. If a woman gets too mad, dudes sure do cater to women. It happen every damn day. Compelled to sell this class of slaves out of deference to the feeling of their white wives, and shockingly scandalous as it may seem for a man to sell his own blood to the traffickers in human flesh, it is often an act of humanity towards the slave child to be thus removed from his merciless tormentors. I'm gonna do one more page. I can't stomach the this passage coming up where they want to talk about white women resistance. I don't want to read that. Douglas' description emphasizes the terrible conditions created by white women for enslaved children of white masters. As he explains, some of these white women had many opportunities and strategies for punishing or harming the enslaved children at their will. That's without the law that this woman keeps talking about. The relationship between white women and the enslaved offspring of their husbands is a reflection of white women negotiating their status as superior to enslaved blacks while also being degraded themselves through their lack of power relative to their husbands. That's a lot of power if you can make them sell. She's not being honest. These enslaved black women who were violated, as well as their children in this case, are reminded of the adultery of their husband, causing them to be a constant offense. Punishment of the children and victimized enslaved women can be seen as an attempt to reinforce the racialization of enslaved blacks in order to secure a racially superior position as a white woman. White women existed and engaged in a system that afforded them enough power to racially subordinate others while enabling white men in their lives to consistently degrade them as white women. As Douglas' description, children were often spared further punishment or abuse from the white wives who were resentful of their husband's behavior. However, selling children was destructive and emotionally devastating to the enslaved families who were separated. One of Benjamin Drew's informants described a similar scenario involving a conflict between a white man, enslaved black woman, and a white man that involved the selling of their children. Benjamin Drew, an American abolitionist, was concerned with providing an accurate account of slavery from the voices of those that were formerly enslaved. One of those accounts is from William Thompson, who was enslaved in Virginia, escaped to Canada where Drew interviewed him. He explains, quote, "I knew a man in the South who had 6 children by a colored slave. Then there was a fuss between him and the wife, and he sold all the children but the oldest slave daughter. Afterwards, he had a child by this daughter. He screwed his own daughter and sold the mother and the child before its birth. This was nearly 40 years ago. Such things are done frequently in the South. One brother sells another. I have seen it done." Thompson's description reflects the way in which tensions between white women and men was alleviated by selling enslaved children. Although the white husband created tensions between him and his wife by sexually violating the enslaved black woman, his solution to his marital quarrels had detrimental consequences to the enslaved black woman and children who were separated from family and friends. The white husband evaded his marital problems and an angry spouse as a result of his sexual actions by forcing the repercussions further down the intersectional hierarchy. However, the white woman avoided feelings of marital betrayal and conflict through her husband's decision. Both the white man and white woman were relieved, see, here they go together, of the consequences of his behavior because they were able to benefit from the privileges and power associated with whiteness that allowed them to maintain a positive public image through the selling of enslaved children. In contrast, the enslaved family experienced the emotional devastation of the rape that often violated romantic arrangements among enslaved men and women and the separation of family members. In 1860, correspondents for a daily newspaper in Wheeling, West Virginia, described the practice of white women selling enslaved women because of their husband's sexual behavior. While traveling by train from Washington to Richmond, this correspondent found in cars a Negro trader a half dozen sons and daughters to sell. He was particularly struck by the beauty of a white girl about 17 years old with white, rosy, transparent complexion, finely chiseled features, and auburn tress. Although he assumed the girl to be the trader's daughter, he was informed instead that the trader had paid $1,200 for her up in Maryland to a man whose wife became jealous of her. This story fully explained the mystery of the gold rings that hung from her ears and encircled her fingers. Many white men gave gifts and jewelry to enslaved women they used for their own as well as to their friends' sexual purposes. The comments regarding her jewelry allude to the sexual violation occurred against this young enslaved woman and explanations of the wife's jealousy which led to her sale. Mind you, she's 12 years, well, she's 17, but then, man, he's been banging this child. Punishing enslaved black women who were victims of white male sexual violence by separating their families did more than simply appease white wives. This form of punishment also allowed white men to conceal their behavior by sending enslaved children who looked like them to other parts of the country. Additionally, white women could uphold the image that their husbands were not having an affair, reducing the humiliation that might otherwise ensue. While white men and women could benefit from selling the enslaved children or the women who were sexually victimized, the consequences rested with the enslaved families that were destroyed in the process. The emotional devastation and familial disruption that were caused by the separation of families merely to stop a fight over jealousy and humiliation were significant costs that enslaved families had to endure because of their lack of legal rights and the desire of whites to maintain their virtuous image in society. An anonymous woman who was formerly enslaved living in Augusta, Georgia at the time of the interview of the Works Progress Administration describes her experience of being sold on account of her being a threat to the white mistress. This woman describes the way the white women used their limited power to influence their husbands in the sale of enslaved women who threatened them. Unlike many cases, however, the enslaved young woman in this instance was likely relieved to be sold away from this household. She explains, quote, "About 2 days later, I was sold to a man at McBean. When I went to his place, everybody told me as soon as I got there how mean he was and that he said his wife was still meaner. She was jealous of me because I was light. Said that she didn't know what her husband wanted to bring that half-white nigger there for. And if he didn't get rid of me pretty quick, she was going to leave. Well, he didn't get rid of me. She left about a month after I got there. When he saw she wasn't coming back till he got rid of me, when he saw she weren't coming back till he got rid of me, he brought me back." Her light skin itself was a threat to the white woman because it was a sign of beauty and sexual attractiveness for white men. Colorism, or the preference for lighter skin, is embedded in slavery and continues to have an effect on the way that people of color are treated today. Although physical attractiveness may have given white women respect towards white women, for enslaved black women, physical attractiveness caused tension and further degradation. To resolve this tension and mitigate sexual threat, white women could use the limited power available to them by threatening to leave their husbands. In some cases, like the one given above, white women were successful in getting what they wanted. A lot of women get what they want. Numerous examples of white women selling or abusing enslaved black women found in documents from slavery reflect a form of resistance and power for white women that served to reinforce the oppression of enslaved black women and their families. These abuses shed light on the way institutions of oppression encourage behavior that reproduces oppression as opposed to deconstructing it. Groups with an intermediary status, such as white women, I may add, Asians and all these illegals and other people, right, are encouraged to reinforce the oppression of those subordinates to themselves, despite the fact that this fails to accomplish gains in power status for anyone other than white men. Still true today. White resistance in the form of abuse, murdering children, and selling enslaved family members was ineffective at deconstructing oppression. Some white women did attempt to find other means of putting up resistance. Through their writing, some wealthy white women voiced their dissatisfaction with the sexual behavior of white men. Unfortunately, in many of these cases, women did so on the grounds of preserving white purity as opposed to protecting the humanity of black women, reflecting a deep white racism, she says racial framing, racism held by whites and the difficulty in resisting oppression without simultaneously reinforcing it. She doesn't like using the word racism. I'm on page 61, and I'm going to stop here because it's really, when I think about it, let me look at this. There's only 14 pages left. I'm going to read some of this later today when I come back from the doctor. And I want to encourage you, pray for me and pray for people to wake up. And I hope that I'm able to keep this up. I miss reading. I miss the Angry Black Men's Book Club. Uh, I don't. I think we got on top of it, and so I appreciate this. Thank you, moderators, El Negro Hotep, Sister Savannah, Sister Mariam, all of you. And I'm going to check out here, and I may be back at this about 3 o'clock, maybe 4 o'clock tomorrow. I'm going to bring some more stuff out. Um, Again, like, subscribe, share. Send this to someone you can't stand. If there's someone that annoys you, please send them all my content. I assure you they'll never write you again. I'm a good way of getting rid of people you don't like. People just can't stand anything I say or do. I don't know why they do this. I don't care. And ladies, never forget Anastasia, the black woman in Brazil. Remember that your allies who talk about intersectionality, for them to put steel and masks and other stuff and to wound and destroy and beat black women so they're ugly. Wake up. We're going to need each other. Time's about to get rough. They're about to release this Epstein list, I suspect. If they release Epstein, there's going to be such a stink. They're going to need to deflect that negative thing off white society. They're going to release Diddy. If there are videos of black men raping white women or children, y'all don't know what the storm is coming. Really. Y'all need to wake up. Pray for peace. Pray for self-defense, for common sense. I'm going to stop here. Love everybody. Pray for me. I got some more books. I'm not going to always read the whole book. Let me get out of here. Good night. I'll be back in touch with y'all. And so let me check out. I got a couple of views over here. Let's see. Oh, wow. 13 over here. What did I get over here?